Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Hamas named the 6 Israeli hostages set for release in the final handover of the ceasefire's first phase, with negotiations for phase 2 due to start in the coming days. The family of Shiri Bibas say they cannot mourn her until her body is returned after Hamas released the remains of an unidentified woman at yesterday's handover. Mike Waltz tells CPAC Zelensky will sign the rare earth deal with the US in exchange for military support. And Germany heads to the polls this weekend as Friedrich Merz emerges as a favourite to take over as the Chancellor. To our top story, and Hamas have named the 6 Israeli hostages to be released this weekend. Eliya Cohen, Omer Shem Tov, Tal Shoham, Omer Wenkert, Hisham al-Sayed and Avera Mengisto will be handed back on Saturday, with Israel expected to free 600 Palestinian prisoners as part of the continuing ceasefire agreement. This release is the final one in this phase of the Gaza truce deal. Meanwhile, Hamas have admitted the remains of the dead Israeli hostage Shiri Bibas were mixed up with other human remains. A coffin believed to contain Shiri's body was handed over to the group yesterday. Israel later revealed they received the remains of an anonymous body without identification. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has warned Hamas they will pay, and Israeli forces have accused them of a serious violation of the ceasefire agreement. We can now speak to the author and Middle East correspondent Yotam Confino in Herzliya. Yotam, thank you so much for joining me. 2 of these hostages are civilians who have been held in Gaza for over a decade. Tell us about them and the others who are part of this final handover of the very first phase.
Yes, so Hisham al-Sayed and Avera Mengisto have both spent over a decade in Gaza. Both of them crossed the border into Gaza. Avera Mengisto did it without knowing. I think he went into Gaza, at least that's the assumption. He's also been suffering from mental illness. He has an Ethiopian background, and his family only really saw proof of life 2 years ago. So for many years, they didn't know if he was even alive. And as for Hisham al-Sayed, he also is dealing with mental illnesses such as schizophrenia. And Hamas falsely claimed that he was a soldier that crossed into Gaza, but he is not a soldier. He is a civilian. And his family also only received proof of life 3 years ago. So they're now slated to come out along with 4 other civilian male hostages tomorrow.
Hamas have said the remains of the dead Israeli hostage Shiri Bibas were mixed up with other human remains. The group claims Shiri and her children were killed in an Israeli airstrike. However, Israeli forces have disputed this. We've now heard from the Bibas family. What have they had to say?
So the Bibas family is, of course, devastated. Not only did they get Ariel, 9 months old, and Kvir, 9 months old, and Ariel, 4 years old, out in body bags. They learned today that after forensic examination, that the terrorists who held them had killed them with their bare hands. That's the Israeli examination. But they also found out that Shiri was not among the hostages who were released. And they don't know why, simply. The only explanation they've gotten from Hamas is that they mixed up the bodies. I don't think anyone in Israel really buys that explanation, because the Bibas family had become a symbol of the hostages, that the whole world really knew who they are. So they were obviously kept in dangerous places inside Gaza. But I believe that the terror groups that held Shiri, they also knew what a price they could extract from her. So Israel is now demanding through the mediators that Hamas release her body immediately.
When are we expecting the second phase of negotiations to start, Yotam? And could this really be more difficult now we've just spoken about the Bibas family and the effect that this could possibly have on a already really fragile agreement?
So as for the second phase in the negotiations, they should have actually started more than 2 weeks ago. But because of all of the chaos and turmoil that happened between Israel and Hamas in the past couple of weeks, these negotiations haven't taken place. But yesterday, Donald Trump, the U.S. president, his Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, was reportedly set to meet with an Israeli minister to start these discussions about implementing the second phase of the ceasefire. And Steve Witkoff apparently also spoke to Qatar, which is mediating all of this. So behind closed doors, I believe that the negotiations have slowly begun, but there's a lot at stake here. And as you mentioned, the fate of the Bibas family could derail everything. After tomorrow, when the 6 alive hostages have been released, there are many people in Israel who believe that Israel will go back to fighting Hamas because they don't have an incentive to continue the ceasefire with a group that constantly violates the deal and also desecrates and humiliates the hostages.
Yotam Confino, author and Middle East correspondent, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. The British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, will meet President Trump at the White House next Thursday. French President Emmanuel Macron will visit on a Monday. Both leaders are set to discuss security guarantees for Ukraine with the US President. A woman who claimed to be the missing Madeleine McCann has been charged with stalking. 23-year-old Julie Wandelt was arrested in England and remanded in custody. McCann's disappearance is one of the world's most puzzling missing child cases after vanishing during a family holiday in Portugal in 2007. Only 1 in 6 Japanese citizens holds a passport, according to some new data. The weakness of Japan's currency, the yen, and rising inflation are among the factors deterring outbound travellers. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, about a quarter of Japanese people held valid passports. The latest dip comes as the country welcomes a record number of tourists from other countries. And a picture of a humpback whale along with its calf has helped Alvaro Herrero earn the title of Underwater Photographer of the Year. The Spaniard was up against 6,750 other entries to claim this year's prize. The competition, which started back in 1965, awards photography beneath the surface of the oceans, lakes, rivers, and even swimming pools, attracting entries from around the world. Now, the Conservative Political Action Conference, also known as CPAC, is currently taking place in Maryland. Earlier today, U.S. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz told the conference he expected President Zelensky to sign the rare minerals deal with the U.S. in exchange for military support. It comes days after a war of words between both Trump and Zelensky, with the U.S. president calling the Ukrainian leader a dictator for refusing to hold elections. We can now go live to Washington to speak to our foreign correspondent, Sarah Firth. Thank you so much for joining me. So despite the back and forth of name calling this week, the minerals deal looks to actually be back on. How much is it worth and what is the US offering in exchange?
Yes, you've got the National Security Advisor speaking today at CPAC, that annual Republican gathering, saying President Zelensky will sign that deal. Now, that deal he's referring to is the deal to give the U.S. access to rare mineral deposits in Ukraine. Now, the U.S. sees this deal as one way to claim back, get compensation for some of the money, both financial support and military support that they've provided Ukraine since the start of the war. But also they say this will be a good economic partnership and provide more security guarantees, if anything, for Ukraine. But what we saw at the start of the week is Ukrainian President Zelensky rejecting that initial agreement. Although it is important to note, he didn't rule out any agreement whatsoever. But as you said, that sparked this pretty explosive war of words. It played a fairly major part in what the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, speaking at the White House on Thursday at a press conference, he told us that President Trump was frustrated with Zelensky over this mineral deal and this war of words that has erupted. The president saying Zelensky's a dictator without elections. Quite remarkable words coming from a sitting US president. And I think what we've seen from the National Security Advisor today, and what we've also seen from an interview with the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is they're trying to take some of the heat out of this very explosive war of words that's occurred between Ukraine and the United States.
Let's talk about Marco Rubio. He said a possible meeting between Trump and Putin will depend on whether any progress is made on ending the war in Ukraine. What else did the Secretary of State have to say? And any update on that meeting between Trump and Putin?
That's what everyone is watching for. He did reveal some new details about the meeting that had been held with Sergei Lavrov, with the Russian foreign minister. He said, look, no details were actually discussed when it comes to talking about possible concessions that Ukraine might have to make when it comes to territory. He said the purpose of this initial meeting was to find out if Russia is interested in talking about an end to the war, is willing to move forward for a peace agreement. When he was asked whether Russia was, he said that he doesn't know right now, that actions here are speaking louder than words. He said action is not a noun, it's a verb. Peace is not a noun, it's a verb. It requires action. So what he's saying is, look, if after this initial meeting that's been had between the foreign ministers, you have Russia coming to the table and asking for things that are maximalist and unrealistic, well, that will speak for itself. Now, that is very interesting context, given the fact that the Ukrainian President Zelensky's clear discomfort with the fact that Ukraine was not at the table. And again, this war of words that has erupted, you can see the Secretary of State was saying, look, all options are still on the table. It's going to need, he said, all sides to participate in any kind of peace agreement if and when that happens. And I think really important to note, you know, here in Washington, you've had so much uproar about what's been happening with this war of words. When you talk to these diplomats and in diplomatic circles here, there's a lot of confusion about what President Trump was trying to do with these comments over Ukraine and President Zelensky. Is there a strategy behind it? Was he just shooting from the hip? The Secretary of State saying, look, that he was very upset with Zelensky, and rightfully so. He described President Trump as someone who's not going to sit back and take what he described as the U.S. being hustled. So again, very strong language, but I really think it's important to note, you know, some of those claims that President Trump has made over the past few days, that Ukraine started the war, for example. You know, I was on the ground actually in Ukraine when that invasion started. It barely needs saying, but here we are having to state it, that it was Russia that started the war. It was Russia that invaded. And it is interesting that, you know, you've got this very heated rhetoric happening here in the corridors of power in the White House behind me. But these are diplomats that haven't necessarily seen war. And these words from President Trump, they have a real life impact potentially on those Ukrainian soldiers fighting on the front line. You can only imagine what they'll be thinking, watching what's been playing out this week. But now, today, you've got the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz. You've had the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, just trying to reduce some of that tension and get the focus back on the move towards some kind of peace agreement.
Sarah Firth, foreign correspondent in Washington, thank you so much for joining me. Now, Germany will go to the polls this weekend following a collapse of a coalition government led by current Chancellor Olaf Scholz. The main opposition party, the Christian Democratic Union, led by Conservative leader Friedrich Merz, is the current favourite, alongside its sister party, the Christian Social Union. The right-wing ADF party has claimed the next spot, according to the latest polls. The state of the economy, migration and Russia's war in Ukraine are among the top issues for voters in this parliamentary election. Let's hear more now from our correspondent, Trent Murray, who's in Berlin. Trent, thank you for joining me. This election in Germany is happening in bitter, cold winter for the first time in decades. Is this significant at all?
Well, Leigh Ann, I think it tells you exactly just how we got here. This election was not meant to be held right now. It was originally slated for the kind of European spring, summer period. It would have made it much nicer, one would imagine, for all of those candidates out door knocking and trying to canvass on the streets. But the reason we're having it now in the depths of the European winter is because Olaf Scholz's former government collapsed after a fairly spectacular divorce with some of those parties that were part of it. And so right now we've been thrust into this early election. Nevertheless, they're trying to not let the weather affect the campaign trail. You certainly still see many party volunteers out on the street trying to bolster their base. But it certainly is, I think, a signal of the fact that this is an early election. It was not intended to take place right now. But those leading candidates for Chancellor are hoping that there might be brighter days ahead, I guess you could say, for them and their parties as they conduct that race for the Chancellery with less than 48 hours to go until polls open.
Yes, indeed. And I was mentioning there in the intro that the CDU is still expected to win. But this might surprise some people, as I feel like the AfD party has been dominating the political agenda in Germany. Why have we seen a rise of the far right there?
Well, look, I think in many ways what Alice Weidel, the leader of the AfD, is doing is trying to tap into some of the discontent that exists, certainly within large swathes of the voting population here. She's really zeroed in on some pretty significant issues, including cracking down on illegal immigration, on rallying against so-called green energy mandates, which she says are strangling Germany's economy, as well as law and order. They are very similar themes to the ones we hear so often now in elections in the West, particularly in Western Europe, and of course with President Trump being elected now in the US. That is clearly working because she is now sitting second in the polls with the AfD. The CDU is still in front at 30% roughly. That's kind of the legacy Conservative Party in this country, the party of former Chancellor Angela Merkel. Where the difficulty will be, though, for the AfD, despite doing very well in the polls right now and being second place, the other parties have a so-called firewall agreement between them. That effectively means they will lock the AfD out from any future negotiations to enter government. They say they're doing that because they think they are right-wing, they think they're extremists. So even if the AfD does very well on Sunday and places a strong second, it's still highly unlikely we will see them enter government. But what it will do is certainly cement Alice Weidel and the party into being a very strong contender as leader of the opposition for next time.
Trent, Germany is Europe's biggest economy. Now, Europe appears to be in this really sticky spot at the moment when it comes to America's comments on Ukraine and also defence spending. How important is this election result for stability across Europe as a whole?
Well, look, I think you can get a sense from it just based on how other European countries are looking at this election. There's a lot of media coverage of it in places like France and Belgium and Italy, because what happens in Germany really has a huge impact on the rest of the EU. As you said, it's the EU's biggest economy. It's the world's third largest economy after China and the United States. And so what happens on Sunday will have a ripple-on effect, not just across Europe and around the world. And you are right. I mean, Europe right now is having some very deep conversations conversations around its sort of role in the world. We've seen President Trump sort of roar back onto the world stage, full of criticism of the EU over issues like trade imbalances and their support for Ukraine. And so right now, in many ways, I think the EU is looking for leadership to try and navigate these sort of turbulent, uncertain waters ahead that are here. And Germany really has to play a crucial role in that, which is why after this election takes place on Sunday, the Chancellor will have a lot of work to do, not just putting into place the campaign promises domestically, but also getting back to that negotiating table in Brussels to try and steer Europe through these quite troubling times.
Yes, indeed. Trent Murray in Berlin, looking very smart in your suit. Thank you very much. A remarkable discovery has been made in Egypt this week. A team of Egyptologists have found the first tomb of the pharaoh since Tutankhamun's was uncovered over a century ago. They located King Thutmose II's tomb near the city of Luxor. I'm now joined by the director of the Egypt Exploration Society and president of the International Association of Egyptologists. That's Dr. Chris Norton. Chris, thank you so much for joining me this evening. So King Thutmose, nice to have you. King Thutmose II's tomb was the last undiscovered royal tomb of the 18th Egyptian dynasty. Why is this such an extraordinary and significant discovery?
Well, I mean, having a kind of new tomb, as it were, of any pharaoh is always going to be exciting. You know, Pharaoh was among the most powerful and wealthy men anywhere in the planet in their day. And these tombs, we know, in cases where they've been well preserved, are often stuffed full of, you know, the finest objects that human beings had created at that time. Thutmose II ruled at a particularly rich and powerful period for the Egyptians, and we know already of the whereabouts of the tombs of almost all the kings who come before and after him. So his was a kind of conspicuous gap in the evidence, and it's been filled.
Actually, there's one question I wanted to ask you, and you just touched on it there. The tomb was completely empty. You know, obviously, we've seen these amazing artifacts in a lot of the other tombs. Why was this?
Well, in fact, they are almost always found more or less empty. We know that these tombs, which were stuffed full of extremely valuable things, were very often robbed. And where we have the evidence for it, we can see that this often happened a very short space of time after the kings even were buried. So even in the case of the tomb of Tutankhamun, we know that that was robbed at least twice within a matter of months of the king being buried there. And in most cases, those tombs are comprehensively ransacked. It's actually just the one or two very celebrated examples, like the tomb of Tutankhamun, which was found substantially intact, that have kind of clouded our judgment. You know, it makes us feel as though that's how it should be, when most of them, in fact, are found in this condition, empty, more or less.
The team weren't expecting to find it where they actually found it. Can you tell us more about the location of the discovery and why it really did take them by surprise?
Yeah, well, the reason is that this is a period of a few centuries, about 5 centuries, during which time the kings were buried in the very famous cemetery, the Valley of the Kings. So, you know, we might have expected to find this missing tomb, as it were, in the valley. And in actual fact, it's some 2.5 kilometers away further into the desert. And the Valley of the Kings is already, you know, in a quite remote location, a long way away from the Nile Valley where people were living, up in the high desert. This is even further, even more remote. And up until this point, we were not aware that there was really very much out there at all. We knew of a few tombs of some members of the royal family in some cases, but of no kings. So there was no sense up until this point that the tomb of a king ought to be there, and yet, you know, here it is suddenly. This is part of the sensation of what's been found.
Yes, absolutely amazing. The joint British and Egyptian team have been working together for 12 years, excavating 54 tombs during that time. Why is it so important teams like this continue to make these potentially groundbreaking discoveries that we're still seeing today, as we've just been talking about?
Well, I think to some extent there's just the sheer joy of new material, and the idea that the apparently barren desert can conceal these incredible things. But they're a window on the ancient past, and I'm not sure I have a very good explanation for it. But we, people like me who are interested in these things, are really, really intrigued to know more about what it was like in the past. It's as though there's a kind of veil that is lifted to some extent. In this case, on the life and death and burial of this king, an incredibly important figure, when we find material like this. And this is undoubtedly going to help us to understand what it was like for the king, what it was like for the Egyptian people all those thousands of years ago. And that's exciting. And the more discoveries we have like this, and the more we can share the news of these discoveries, the more I think people are going to get hooked in and interested in the ancient past.
Egyptologist Dr. Chris Norton, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thank you.
Let's take a look at the top business news. Gold prices edged lower on Friday but remain on track for an 8th weekly gain. The rally is supported by safe haven demand on concerns over US President Donald Trump's tariff threats. Prices have shattered 2 record highs this week to trade above $2,950 a troy ounce, with Goldman Sachs seeing gold rising above $3,000 by the end of this year. Now, there's been a surprise boost for UK retail as food sales see the biggest jump since the start of the pandemic. Shops were given a big boost in January as retail sales rose as much as 1.7%, much more than the 0.3% rise forecast by economists. Growing retail sales can mean economic growth, which the government has repeatedly said is one of its top priorities. Let's turn to sports news now, and Premier League leaders will play Paris Saint-Germain, Arsenal will face PSV Eindhoven, and Aston Villa take on Club Brugge in Champions League Final 16. Real Madrid, who knocked out Man City in the knockout phase, will face local rivals Atletico Madrid, whilst Bayern Munich are up against Bayer Leverkusen. The 2-legged last 16 ties will be played on the 4th and 5th of March and the 11th and also the 12th of March. Now, PGA Tour is holding constructive talks with Donald Trump and also Live Golf. Conversations have been ongoing since the PGA Tour and DP World Tour agreed a shock merger with Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, which funds Live Golf. And those talks of a merger were announced in June. Live Golf chairman Yasser Al-Ruhanem, US President Donald Trump, PGA Tour Commissioner Jay Monahan, and player director Adam Scott, as well as Tiger Woods, all met at the White House yesterday. Now, the Neom project in Saudi Arabia is one of the world's most revolutionary urban developments. And this week, Al Arabiya News was given exclusive access to the site. Phase 1 is due for completion by 2034. The line will allow visitors to experience the most beautiful marina in the heart of the Red Sea. The area will feature 80,000 residential units and 9,000 hotel rooms, as well as a brand new stadium to host matches during the 2034 FIFA World Cup in Saudi Arabia. I'm now pleased to say that I'm joined in the studio by Al Arabiya English journalist Jennifer Bell, who's been given that exclusive access to look at the site, and she got the chance to meet people behind it. Hi, Jennifer. Thank you for joining me this evening. Jennifer, pretty amazing access, and you've seen the progress firsthand. What's happening at the flagship line project?
Well, it's been a hive of activity. There's about a 10,000-strong workforce there, just at the line itself, and ground has been broken. Excavation has started, and what we can see there is a start of what's going to be phase 1 of the 170-kilometre line. So phase 1 is going to be 2.4 kilometres, yes, we're going to see that phase come into fruition by about 2034. It will have, as we just heard, residential units, hotels, and what they say were the world's biggest football stadium. So it will open just in time for the FIFA World Cup in Saudi Arabia in 2034.
Absolutely amazing project, as we said, but extremely, extremely ambitious.
Yes.
It's going to be massive, like almost the size of New York or bigger. But tell me, you spoke to the senior Neom officials about this. What are they saying about the construction timeline?
Well, I think, first of all, they would like to kind of hit back at some scepticism. I mean, I think there has been some rumours about when it's going to be done, if it's been scaled back, and we spoke to 2 senior executives, and they have both dismissed that scepticism. They said this project was always one that was going to be delivered in phases. Phase 1 is very much on track. But like you said, I mean, 2.4 kilometres doesn't sound that big, but putting that into perspective, that's like, it's going to be the size of 2 football pitches side by side, and it's going to be half a kilometre tall. So it'd be like building 40 of the Burj Khalifas, the world's tallest skyscrapers, in that 2.4 kilometre block. So you can't do that overnight. So very much on track, and it will be delivered when it will be delivered, basically.
Yeah, of course, in time for that World Cup, like you said. As we understand, the entire Neom mega project has been developed on only a fraction of the total space. So what's happening with the rest of the land surrounding it?
Of course. So when I went there, I was astonished at the size of it. I mean, it's 26,500 square kilometres, but they're only developing 5% of that. 95% of it is going to be reserved for nature, rewilding, regreening, and we saw the start of that. I mean, we saw some of this wildlife being reintroduced into the area that hasn't been seen in decades, from, gazelles to oryxes to ostriches, and then by the end of the year, they want to reintroduce cheetahs. They've also planted more than kind of 4 million trees as part of the rewilding project, and a lot of the work has been done to preserve historical sites. We got a glimpse at a site in Badger where they're preserving this rock called Shiprock, and they've uncovered inscriptions dating back to the prehistoric time. So I think preserving this rich history has been key to the project.
Yes, indeed. And a project of this scale would require thousands of labourers and other staff, and a large amount of resources, of course. How is Neom managing to attract and provide for this workforce that's needed?
Well, I mean, they already have attracted. I mean, there's a 100-strong workforce across Neom. Like I said, 10,000 of those at the line. And I guess there's so many benefits. I mean, I got access to one of the communities there called NC1, and it's just like any other modern city. You've got, malls and cinemas and football pitches and basketball courts and everything a resident could want. I mean, we actually talked to one of the residents down there. She had an interesting story. She was the first Neom employee to have a baby in this community. And she said, a good thing, I can't think of anywhere safer in the world to bring up a family or somewhere that's more community orientated. So I think these communities are serving their needs.
Yeah, life has been born, if you want to say it in 2 different ways. But we also just had a quick chat about dolphins and marine life, because that's something that I'd be really interested in. They also are making a big push for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key word for Neom is sustainability. And so everything has been done in a very eco-friendly, green way to really preserve the nature, and because they want nature to be a huge part of the tourism experience at Neom. So there'll be some of the best diving sites in the world, some of the best nature reserves in the world. I mean, so when the gates are open, all this is done, I mean, tourists will get access to some incredible sites of nature, including dolphins.
And you've already chosen your unit.
I have. I'm asking Arabiya to move me out there. It's an incredible place to live and work.
I might ask the same question. We can live side by side. Thank you so much, Jennifer Bell from Arabiya English, journalist. We really appreciate you. Thank you. Now, a reminder of our top stories. Hamas named the 6 Israeli hostages set for release in the final handover of the ceasefire's first phase, with negotiations for phase 2 due to start in the coming days. The family of Shiri Bibas say they cannot mourn her until her body is returned after Hamas released the remains of an unidentified woman at yesterday's handover. Mike Waltz tells CPAC Zelensky will sign the rare earth deal with the US in exchange for military support. And Germany heads to the polls this weekend as Friedrich Merz emerges as a favourite to take over as Chancellor. And that's all from us on W News. Thank you so much for joining us. Riz Khan is coming up next, followed by Hadley Gamble. And of course, don't miss Tom Burges Watson with GNT. Good night and happy Friday.
At our Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Al Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
And we will pursue our manifest destiny into the stars, launching American astronauts to plant the stars and stripes on the planet Mars.
Six decades after Star Trek's Captain James T. Kirk began his mission to boldly go where no man has gone before, US President Donald Trump has vowed to make the science fiction character's pledge a reality. Well, critics of such a mission to Mars have called it an expensive vanity project with no return on investment. But for others, the announcement of such astral ambition within an inauguration address has inspired a new era of excitement about space exploration. And it's an exciting time for the global space economy overall, as SpaceX and Blue Origins lead a growing private sector pursuit of orbital opportunities. Up to 100 countries now have some form of space program, with India and Japan and countries in Africa and the Middle East joining the established space nations in Western Europe, Russia, China, and the US. The upside is unlimited. Beyond space tourism and the mining of asteroids for valuable minerals, there's the prospect of new jobs, new skills, and entirely new industries developing. But there are challenges too. What will be the impact of AI? How should we regulate space so it doesn't become a wild west of competing companies and countries? And how can we ensure the space race doesn't develop into Star Wars? Well, my guest on this episode was Donald Trump's Director of Space Commerce during his first presidency. He was awarded the Vice President's Dedicated Service Award for his support to the National Space Council and has been given a Lifetime Achievement Award for his work in space commerce. As CEO of Space Economy Rising, he advises key players on all aspects of the global space economy. And I'm delighted to say that Kevin O'Connell joins me now in the studio. Kevin, I'm really glad you could join us. There's a lot to talk about. Now, I have to start by asking you, what do we actually mean when we say the global space economy? Is it about rockets, satellite, space tourism, or is there more to it than that?
So it's much more than that, actually, Riz, and thanks for having me today. Really, when you talk about the global space economy, it's really anything that is involved in exploring, leveraging resources, understanding what is going on in space, and frankly, how it affects things on Earth. The canonical way to think about this is to see the rocket blasting off the pad, and that's absolutely necessary. But the phrase I like to use on the space economy is that it's really accelerating and diversifying. And so we can look at traditional market segments like communications, like navigation, sensing, and those are all changing at lightning speed. We can talk more about that. But we also have newer market segments that are coming into the market, like space medicine, space food, and even lunar regolith and things that are going to happen in what will become the lunar economy.
We definitely have to touch on some of those. But, you know, as a layman, space exploration sounds a lot sexier than space commerce. as an expression? Does it need to be rebranded?
I think they're both. I think they're both sexy. Actually, I'm excited about the economic aspects of space. That's one of the things that I've paid a lot of attention to in my career. I remember writing about remote sensing markets in the late 90s and getting a lot of hate mail that said this is only about governments. This is not about, well, that's still a market, but and so I think the economic aspects are important, really because we're benefiting in so many ways here on Earth. I mean, one of the challenges we have in the space business is that most people don't know that when they go to their cell phone, half the applications on their cell phone really are somehow plugged into space, the precise timing signal, communications, other things like that. And so the extent to which we're leveraging space 10, 20, 30 more times a day is really incredible. We have to have people understand that they're benefiting in that way. The exploration piece is critically important for human understanding and understanding what's going on in the universe. But so I think they're equally sexy in that context.
Yeah. I guess it's because I'm really that kind of the Star Trek and Star Wars fan, and it's all about that part of it. Whereas really you're on the practical side. I mean, you yourself say you're not a typical space guy.
Right. I mean, I really have focused mostly on economics. Sometimes to really shock a space audience, I'll say I was not a Star Trek fan or a Star Wars fan as a kid, and that really gets a groan out of the audience. But I've really always thought about it in terms of the benefits that we create, not only from understanding what's going on deeper into the universe, but also how we're able to leverage that to improve our lives here on Earth.
Well, in 2019, there was a report that said that 60% of life on Earth is dependent now on space technology. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it's probably much more than that today, as it turns out. When we're talking about the numbers, what we're really talking about here globally is a roughly $600 billion economy. That includes everything that NASA's doing, that the UAE Space Agency is doing, that others are doing, but also the commercial activities. And the statistics that most people don't know is that roughly 80% of what is going on globally is actually considered commercial. Now, we could spend a lot of time defining that. I don't think we need to for this purpose. In terms of estimates, we think that this is headed toward about a $1.8 trillion market. This is the World Economic Forum's number, by about 2035. I have to be candid. I'm always skeptical of those numbers only because I think we're undercounting, because of the difficulty of counting how much we're actually using space per day. I'm also an optimist, and so when I see those numbers, I think we're actually using space a lot more than we can typically account for. It's analytically a challenging thing to do.
So you're saying it's at around 600 billion now, but that's probably not a fully reflective figure.
That would be my view, yes.
But I know when I listen to you, do podcasts and do interviews, you talk about space as that trillion-dollar economy.
Absolutely. And over the years, the estimates have gone between, say, 1.8 is the current World Economic Forum number, and some years back there was as much as a $3 trillion estimate by 2030. And so we're going to be somewhere in there. When you think of it, though, if you were just to grow aggressively between now and 2030, you'd get very close to those numbers. So that's really a relatively conservative number. I don't think we're accounting for a number of the developments, these other verticals. We're not counting for the possibility of Starship becoming, if you will, the railroad, the high frontier, all sorts of other things that would actually accelerate those numbers. And the numbers are not so important as diving down into every one of the verticals that are the things that are the real meat and potatoes of what's happening.
I want to ask you about Starship a little bit later. It's fascinating. But you talk about investments having shifted in terms of space commerce, from risk investment to value investment. What does that mean?
So let's talk overall about space investment. Governments are still important in investing in space, essentially in setting strategy, complying with the Outer Space Treaty and the governance issues. And so let's not dismiss governance. The trend that has really changed this explosively over the last few years has been the arrival of private capital into the market. And so the extent to which we had very robust private capital in 2018, 2019, 2020, in 21 we have a record high globally of private investment in space. Then the world changes. We have a war in Ukraine. We have a whole series of other things. The global macroeconomic condition changes. And so space investment on the private side plummets. And so right now, where I'm optimistic is the private investment community is ready to come back in right now.
Those figures for 2021, because I heard you talk about that, it was like 47 billion in 2021.
It was 42 billion in 21, and then it dropped to single digits in 22 and 23. And I think we're seeing an uptick now in early through 24 and now in 25 as well. I've been spending a lot of time at investor conferences and talking to people who really think they understand now what makes a better space company. In some ways, it's really, it's a company. And so we like to think of space companies as being special in many ways, and they certainly are. But at the end of the day, they have to have customers. They have to make assumptions about their pipelines. They have to make assumptions about their technology and the regulations and things like that. And so in some ways, we now understand what makes a good space company as opposed to people that just have some interesting ideas.
Generally, though, Kevin, which sectors in terms of space investment are the most interesting ones for people now?
Well, so I think there are people that are very interested in the traditional ones, again, sensing and navigation. We're looking for new ways to do navigation. We're looking to exploit a lot of the sense data that we're collecting. I've been focused on that particular market segment for about 30 years. And one always hears about the demise of satellite remote sensing. And what entrepreneurs have done is simply change to new technologies, change to new phenomenologies, different kinds of sensing modes. And now, of course, I'm sure we'll get to it, the application of machine learning and artificial intelligence to that story. So, I don't like to pick any one area. I think there's some other areas like space sustainability that we should spend a couple of minutes on as well. How are we going to make sure that we're able to create similar innovations in space in the next 6 decades than the ones we've invented heretofore?
That leads me to ask, though, where is the balance between spending on research and development and on operations?
So I think there's government investment is important, and so is private investment. And the way I like to think of that is to say, when you want to take a high-risk mission or a high level of R&D, that's typically where government is going to invest. Private sector often helps operationalize activities that are going on in space. And so another way to think about this is that private finance actually is an accelerator of innovation because it's looking to seeks differentiation between different ideas, and it looks at risk in a different way than the government does. And frankly, we're able to take risk in space today because of the government investments in space for the past 6 decades.
As someone who specializes in this, Kevin, what do you see as the greatest risks and the greatest returns?
So in terms of risk, we certainly have a challenge with what we'll call space safety and sustainability. I spent a lot of time while I was the Commerce Department on this topic, and I've spent a lot of time since I left. The extent to which there is a whole range of debris in space, ranging from small paint chips to larger rocket bodies, by some estimates as much as 130 million pieces of debris moving around at 17,000 miles per hour. Even a paint chip moving that quickly can do considerable harm. And so we have to get our hands around the safety aspect of that. How are we going to make sure that operators can operate safely in such a debris field? The first concern, of course, is the International Space Station, astronauts on board the space station, and the lives of astronauts. That's the paramount concern we have in space. And then the extent to which we want to make space sustainable so that we can do all the exciting things in the space economy that are envisioned for the future, the things we expect out of the space economy.
Is enough thought being given to this sustainability? Because what we hear in the news, obviously, is the number of satellites being launched, the things that are being pushed into space have gone up radically in numbers, but people don't tend to talk about all the debris and stuff as much.
So I think there's a lot more talk about it. There needs to be a lot more action about it. And, I tend to think about this in a private sector way, because for years, a lot of people have said to me, the private sector doesn't care about this, Kevin. And I think if you thought about that for just a moment, you'd think that's a really silly way to think about it, because if I'm a business owner, I want to think about the ability to create new sources of revenue, new sources of profit, and new innovations in space that will make me continue to provide services to people. So I think about this very much like I thought about cybersecurity about 10 years ago. CEOs would say, gee, I don't want to spend a lot of money on cybersecurity. The government will tell me if I have a problem and we'll deal with it. Well, it didn't play out that way, obviously. I think safety and sustainability will come in the same direction here, which is owners that want to ensure mission assurance for their missions, for their customers, are going to see this as a necessary cost of doing business. And so there's a lot of talk. It's a very complex problem. It's got technical complexities. It's got organizational complexities. Different governments have different regulatory actions that govern how people go to space and what they do in space. So it's a hugely complicated problem. Here too, though, I think that the private sector will lead the way in saying, what are the practical rules of the road? For obvious reasons, the international governance situation right now is complicated, and if nothing else, it just moves slower than technology and policy typically do. And so the private sector will come up with ways to say, this is how we should actually approach these issues. You know, these are practical rules of the road that ideally, if they're good, will be codified ultimately in some sort of international governance regime.
I'll touch a little bit more on that in a second, but I'm curious, you know, is there enough money, for example, being raised? Is there a shortage of money in space investment, or is it still quite attractive, and is it attracting money?
No, I think it's attracting money again. I think we've gone through this dip in that 21 to 24 timeframe that we talked about. And again, it's not only because of things that went on in the space business. Space is a place where patient capital is needed. It's not something where you turn around in 3 years. And so there are sort of inherent things to the space business per se, but there are also global economic and geopolitical issues that also change that. Now we see people ready to come back in. We have a new administration in the United States that is going to focus a lot on going back to space in a more aggressive way. It's always been a bipartisan concern in the United States to go back with a vibrant commercial space industry. So is there enough money? You know, I think what all business people would tell you, there's never enough money, but certainly people are coming back into the market now with a better sense of what's being done, why it's important. For a lot of ideas, space has really given us, and this is maybe where we merge your question, your very first question, this is where we merge the space exploration piece with the space commerce piece. Some of the science that is going on the International Space Station is absolutely breathtaking. One of the highlight projects for last year was the 3D printing of heart tissue. Okay, and you think to yourself, that is an incredible technology, and there are many, many other examples of that. The question with this is, can anybody actually make a profit going to space, absorbing the cost of going and bringing it back, okay? Or, in another context, is it so important for us in many ways that governments just decide to fund that as an operational capability? We're seeing a lot of people explore these areas.
Is it something the general public can invest in? If I suddenly say I want to invest in space as a member of the public, is it something I can do? Oh, absolutely. There are a number of companies. I want to say about 100 companies that are public in space. There are many more that are private behind that. There's a huge ecosystem. Obviously, we have one in the United States and Europe, even here in the Middle East, Japan, all have vibrant ecosystems for exploring different pathways to space. How have advancements in launch technology and reusable rockets affected the economics of space? So they've hugely affected it. In fact, when you go back 15, 20 years, if you were an entrepreneur and said, I have a great idea, it might take you 5 years to get a launch. It might cost you $10 million to get a launch. Well, there are very few people that have a great idea that can actually pursue that. Not zero, but there are very few people. And so what we have today is a launch ecosystem that actually allows an entrepreneur to say, gee, I've got an idea, I'm going to try it, okay? And maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work, maybe you adjust it, but then I can go back 6 months later and launch the replacement. And that's an innovative process that we have that is very, very different. The other thing, Riz, is that I'm excited about the space economy. For most applications historically, the space business was a we'll invent it, you figure out how to use it business, okay? And what we have today is so many other sectors of the economy are saying, gee, space is now more affordable and more accessible even. I can get to it, that I'm going to put down a $250,000 R&D project. And so when we look at fields like agriculture and pharmaceuticals and material science and things like that, now we're going to create a whole new wave of innovation based on the fact that other people can now leverage space and create a whole new set of demands for space. You know, Kevin, one of the worries that people have when it comes to something being commercialized is if it's profit-driven, then there's the risk of the profit motive causing cutbacks in areas that could affect safety. We've seen it to some degree in the airline industry in places. What risk is there that, in this, if there's a huge surge for profit motive, that space becomes one of those that's also vulnerable? And of course, the consequences could be even worse there. How can we avoid that? That the profit drives cutbacks and things, or cutting corners?
So I think we have a sense of safety in space. Again, for 6 decades, the experiences that we've had mostly through governments are now allowing us to understand places we can take risk in space and maybe where we ought not. And governments still regulate space, okay? Now, we want them to regulate in a light touch way. We want them to consider the entrepreneur's interest in addition to safety and security considerations, which have always been classic ways that regulators have thought about space. And there are actually ways for regulators to encourage industry in a way that encourages the business forward in a responsible way.
In the past, when people talked about the space race, it was largely the US and Russia, Soviet Union, I guess, at that time, and then China came into the picture. But now we have many more initiatives, Europe, India, Japan, and others. Give me a sense of how many, because you mentioned it a little earlier about people coming in from other countries. How many nations have space programs now?
So I think the last time we looked, there were almost 100 countries that had some kind of a capability in space. And, you see the United States, China, Japan, Europe being some of the larger participants in space, but you also see countries now exploring this. This is another place where countries are very excited about what can be done with the space economy. Years ago, I had an interview with a senior minister, and he was very excited about space. And he said to me, Kevin, I'm going to have, for my country, I'm going to have a launch capability and a sensing capability and a navigation and I said, respectfully, Minister, no, you're not, because you can't afford it, actually. But what we are seeing is we're seeing countries starting to focus on what space can actually do for them in terms of connecting people on Earth, in terms of bringing education to people that could not have it historically, in terms of understanding how we're making use of resources on the planet. These are compellingly important. And then space, of course, is so centrally linked to the data economy that we use in our lives every single day. We see, in addition to those 90 or 100 space programs, we see tremendous interest in space around the world.
Well, I was going to say, we are sitting here in the Middle East where there has been a push into the space programs. How ambitious has this region been from what you've discovered?
Oh, I think it's been very ambitious. We're sitting here in Dubai, and the Emirates have done a tremendous job with their plans for Martian exploration. They have a satellite that's actually surveying Mars as we speak. They've done it very, very conscientious of the need to someday explore Mars and to basically land people on Mars. We have those same aims as well. We see interest in Riyadh, obviously, and now growing a space capability. And so we see you don't have to be a big country anymore to do this. I like to use the Luxembourg example. For example, there is a playful joke in Luxembourg that we use more space, we occupy more space in space than we occupy here on Earth. And so it's not confined to only people who have large geographies on Earth. You do need to spend some money on it, obviously. And what I like to say is it's one thing to be enthusiastic about space. It's another thing to be almost calculating about how does a country actually focus? What does it focus on? To go back to my minister friend, he was just being excited about space. He wasn't thinking critically about the industrial base. He wasn't thinking about academia in his country to say, what is the best chance for me to leverage those capabilities and skills for the things that our country wants to do in space? Regional partnerships and global partnerships are also important as well in that context.
On that note, how much at a global level, how much is there collaboration versus competition?
So I think there's both, actually. I mean, we talk about ourselves being in a race with the Chinese at this point. It's interesting to see how China has come along in the last few decades very, very aggressively. There's a tremendous amount of competition, but there's also cooperation. In the first Trump administration, we had the initiation of the Artemis Accords. That's 50 nations that have actually committed to going back to the moon permanently and sustainably. We'll see how that's adjusted in the second Trump administration. But when we go to the moon or we go to space, we don't just go with the things that we have, we bring our values to space. And so when you look at the Artemis principles, those principles really are about how we intend to share data, to provide for safety of astronauts and others. So there's a lot of basis for cooperation. On the military side, there's also historically been, at least for the United States and what we call the Five Eyes countries, there's been tremendous cooperation in this area, in addition to other partners. We just had the Japanese Prime Minister in Washington, and he and the President have actually reaffirmed pursuits in space together.
How is the role of companies like SpaceX, Elon Musk's company, and Blue Horizon, Jeff Bezos' company, two richest men in the world, how has that evolved the space sector in the past decade? And have you worked with them?
So we've worked with them. Certainly, we're in the government. We have contacts with them in the private sector. Obviously, in my current role, I mean, what they've essentially done is lower the launch costs to get to orbit that we talked about a little bit earlier. It's making space more accessible. It's also in Starlink, you're having, this is a second service that SpaceX is providing. You're providing communications to people that historically did not have access to communications. And so we're seeing tremendous capability to be leveraged by virtue of being able to get to space easier, faster, cheaper than we did historically.
I want to touch on something we briefly referred to. It's SpaceX's Starship project.
Yes.
The largest liftoff, I think, that occurred. And it's supposed to have the capability of taking like up to 100 passengers into space down the road. How much has that advanced the prospect of human presence in space?
Well, I think it's advanced all manner of space. I mean, the test flights have gotten more and more successful, obviously. And as I think I said earlier, this is, this could be the railway express of the space economy. It will certainly, in the first instance, allow us to get lots of material into space in a much more significant way than we have historically. The human piece will come at some point, probably sooner rather than later. One of the trends in the space community that I can remember from my time is that people would come in and say, hey, I've got a great new idea. And historically, someone would say, gee, that's okay. Come talk to me in a decade. Come back and talk to me in a decade about that. That's not the world we live in anymore. The world we live in today is these technology changes may actually be coming so quickly that the capabilities are years away, maybe even months away, frankly, as people are investing in them in multiple ways. And so with Starship, we see a huge potential not only to bring considerable amount of space objects, et cetera, manufacturing plants, things like that into space relatively quickly, not small piece by small piece, but then the human piece will come behind that, obviously.
A lot of people might sort of, knowing how big SpaceX has become and Blue Horizon, these companies become so big and so significant in progressing things, there might be a feeling that certainly within the USA, the private sector has now kind of taken over. Has the government effectively stepped down or been pushed out because of this? No, I wouldn't say it's been pushed out at all. Again, as I said before, both government investment and private investment are very important for our space pursuits writ large. They're not pushed out at all. Obviously, the United States government governs the activities that go on in space, as do every other governments that are managing space activities for their countries. We wrote an op-ed back in September on this topic, on the themes that governments had to think about in order to have an effective contribution and grow their contributions in the space economy. And so governments have not gone away in any way, shape, or form. They're still going to provide important management, governance, and then obviously some levels of funding. But the reality is, around the world, the commercial sector is the predominant player in space. It may sound like a strange question, but is NASA still relevant? Oh, absolutely. Hugely relevant. It's going to undergo some changes now, we see. And so, but the space agencies are relevant because they understand what scientific priorities there are. They actually set technology challenges for industry. So an example, one of the top priorities for NASA this past year was surviving the lunar night as one of the technology challenges. And say, well, why would you want to do that? If we're going to have a vibrant lunar economy,
We need to be able to survive what's a very cold and dark lunar night. That's going to be a force for innovation in something we worked on in the last Trump administration, which was space nuclear power, small modular reactors, because that's the difference between a small lunar economy, mostly driven by government investment, to one which is much larger, much more commercial in nature. And so that's just one example. So governments are still very, and NASA specifically, hugely important.
Something we did touch on early on too was AI, and how AI seems to be ready to revolutionize what we do in space. How do you see its impact in these kind of matters?
So we're seeing it already impact in multiple ways, and I think people are implementing it carefully. There's a lot of noise about AI right now, in addition to the things that are being done usefully. And I think in the first instance, what we have is we see AI being used to make things more efficient. So in the satellite imagery world, historically, and I'm going back many years now, we used to have light tables and we had film and we had to actually find images and say, where is yesterday's image of that same place relative to today? Okay, we're not in that world anymore, thank goodness. But what we also see now is an ability to quickly, using AI, bring together similar scenes or similar kinds of phenomenology. So I may have satellite imagery, but I may have 10 other data sets that I want to bring together and correlate very quickly. I have the same thing in communication satellites. Where do I have throughput that I can take advantage of at a much faster than human capacity? So I think that's one aspect at the lower end. But AI will certainly also be more exploratory. We use AI to actually help with complex processes on board spacecraft. We're going to use them. I know the European Space Agency has a project right now designed to use AI when spacecraft get to places that nothing is known about. And so how will it make a decision about the environment when none of us has seen it before?
There's no data on it.
There's no data on it, exactly. And so what's your best guess at that point based on all the scientific knowledge that we have? So it's going to have huge potential for the space business. As I said, I think it's going to be applied carefully to start, and it's going to be applied to great effect, and once again changing the economics of what's going on in space.
So very recently on this show, I had the former chief business officer of Google X, that X Development as it's known now. We talked about artificial intelligence, and Mo Godat, who's a real wizard with AI stuff, said that he thinks that once someone has got kind of top position in AI, once one player becomes the dominant one, it will take over and no one else will, that will never reverse. Is that the case with space? That when someone really gets the kind of reaches the top in terms of what it's doing in space, one of the countries, and maybe the USA, that no one else will ever be able to catch up or be able to overtake it?
Well, so we've always been the dominant power in space, ever since the Cold War, and we're going to continue to push in that direction to maintain American leadership, not just by ourselves, but with our partners as well, as we talked earlier. And so I think it's still a place where we're going to see competition. There has to be cooperation around a certain number of issues, like the space debris issue, the extent to which we're letting operators know what's happening. There has to be some level of cooperation with the Russians and the Chinese, frankly. But I don't think this is a winner-take-all space. I think the challenge in space here from a military perspective is going to be, can we not only protect the assets that we have today, and that, again, includes those human beings, those good souls that are sitting on the International Space Station. But can we also do it in such a way that protects the growth of space commerce? That's very much like the naval metaphor. If you're a fan of historical metaphors, it's very much like the naval metaphor, that the Navy's role was as much to protect commerce on the high seas as other national security and military functions.
Talking of naval issues, we're seeing, accusations of essential cables being cut underwater in conflicts and so on. That, in theory, could translate into space too, then?
It can, but be careful, because the capacity in space, we get very excited about all the capacity we have. We're not quite there yet. There's so much traffic that transits those undersea cables that we just don't have the capacity. Some people think it's less than 10% that could be kicked up to space. And so that's another reason why we should expect to see more and more growth in space as a source of resilience for things that we do on Earth for our national security.
Kevin, how do you see the impact of space tourism affecting the space economy?
So I think for all of my excitement about the space economy, the space tourism area is something that I think for a while is going to remain the purview of a relatively small number of people that are going to space. You know, we just had a debate with a colleague in New York City on a show, and the question was, why commercial space stations? Because obviously post-International Space Station, there will be at least one, maybe more commercial space stations that will come into the market to provide those services. And the debate was, what's the value proposition for those? And my colleague's comment was, it's all about space tourism. I don't think that's correct. I think you'll continue to have space tourists, but you're also going to see continuation of the huge demand we have for research in the microgravity environment. I mean, today it's very hard to get, as the International Space Station gets closer and closer to its end, you're seeing tremendous demand for research, and it's pretty much sold out. You know, I mean, sometimes people can get a very interesting project on board, but I think the research premise is the premise for space stations going forward. You'll always have tourists, but I think for the long run, that's not a huge business. I've just been working on a project back in Washington, and in fact, when you look as recently as 2019, there are estimates of thousands of launches by today, you know, mainly because of space tourism. That didn't happen, and there's lots of good reasons why it didn't, but I think that's pretty much the trend we're going to stay on.
Recently in the news, there's been word of an asteroid that might just hit Earth. Now, if that is the case, an asteroid's heading for Earth, and a mission has to be mounted to divert it, take care of it somehow, who's responsible? Who pays for it? How does that get organized?
Well, so those are questions that's a big question, but it's not the only question of that sort. Obviously, NASA has been doing some experimentation on planetary defense. The DART, what was called the DART mission, was successful in diverting an asteroid. And so obviously we're going to worry a lot about that. The key is sensing those, making sure we have a keen understanding of the ones that are really worrisome, the ones where we might have to take action. Who's going to pay for it? I mean, you know, we're all going to pay for it at that point. If it comes that close that we have to go against it, we're all going to pay for it.
How far are we off mining minerals, essential minerals and things of asteroids?
Oh, I think on asteroids, so it's already been proven. You know, the Japanese had a successful mission. We had a successful mission in the United States. And so I think the asteroid mining market is still a little bit of ways off. But the moon is going to represent a place where we're going to learn more about how to do that. Again, in the lunar economy now, we have people going that are bringing landers to the moon, that are going to be doing experiments, picking up lunar regolith, you know, understanding what the material makeup is. The key scientific question on the moon is the quality of the water ice, because if the water is of sufficiently high quality and can be processed, that becomes your fuel to keep going. And so that's a hugely important question.
We touched on it a bit, but who will ultimately regulate issues when it comes to space? Now, of course, there are governments. As you say, there's already a number of agreements in place. But if private money starts to dominate, how much will they have an influence on how these regulations are set?
Well, so I think they'll have some influence through their national governments. Obviously, there's a system in place through the United Nations to have discussions about this. The Committee for the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space is one important forum. And so those are just slow-going discussions because you have to get consensus decision-making and things like that. And so, again, I think you'll see more emphasis on national governments regulating. Okay, nobody wants to be irresponsible. They want to be responsible. But I think one of the key questions in the future is going to be, to what extent can the private sector actually benefit from the things that they're actually doing in space? You don't want to dampen the entrepreneurial spirit. You want to be responsible. And so protecting sites on the moon and things like that are some of the early decisions that are coming up in this area.
Knowing the potential that's out there, Kevin, what risk is there of a kind of Wild West style gold rush into space?
I think, that's a phrase that people often use in space. I mean, I think we're a little more sensible than that. There's certainly potential to do some things very, very rapidly. I think you want to see entrepreneurship in space continue at a fairly aggressive pace. You want to see people understanding what can be done, what might be done, and take advantage of that. Will there be uncertainties, just as there were in the wild, to stick with the metaphor, in the Wild West? Of course there will be. And in some cases, the person who gets there first will be able to take advantage of things first. It's really simple.
There's also the issue of, like the Wild West, weapons. I mean, at this stage, what regulations are there to control weaponry in space?
So, of course, the Outer Space Treaty essentially precludes the use of nuclear capabilities in space. And the Russians, there was a lot of hubbub last year. The Russians may have actually violated that premise. And so there's not a lot of rigorous international law about the use of weapons in space, because what constitutes a weapon? This mug could be a weapon in space. And so there's a lot of work to be done in that area, and it's not just kinetic activities, but it's also cyber activities and things like that.
Well, I was thinking, with a world that seems increasingly divided, what risk is that those geopolitical divisions shift into space too?
They absolutely could. There's a real risk of that, and we have to work very hard to make sure that they don't, because of the promise that at least I've been talking about here, all the things that we're going to rely on and that we expect from outer space. I've said publicly, I think we could see more economic benefit from space in our lifetimes than we've seen in all of human history. That's a pretty bold statement, but it's not automatic. We have to deal with issues like this, where there's geopolitical risk that could turn to military conflict. We have to deal with the debris problem. We have to deal with a lot of things. So don't take the first part of my statement as only, we have to do the other things that actually make space safe and sustainable for the future.
I should point out to our viewers and listeners, Kevin, that apart from space commerce and your experience with that, which is pretty broad, you've also worked in defense and national security.
Absolutely.
And I wonder, from your perspective, having especially worked with people like Donald Trump in his first presidency, what does the U.S. fear from Russia and Chinese in terms of their intentions in space?
So we really are concerned about missiles. Obviously, the president has now signed a new executive order for an Iron Dome system that will prevent ballistic missiles, hypersonic missiles, others from coming into the country. That will be a huge investment for that specific purpose. And so I think that's one concern, obviously. The other thing is that we're concerned about the irresponsible behavior in space. In November of 2021, the Russians launched a kinetic ASAT test from Earth into space to destroy one of their defunct satellites. That was really a message that said, if we do it to that, we can do it to you. But in the process, created a tremendous amount of debris that we all have to deal with. Okay, it's not just against any one country. We all have to deal with that debris. And that debris wound up creating what operators called squalls of notice. Because if you're around up there flying in orbit, then you're getting notices all the time that you're at risk of being collided. And so what you have to do is make hard decisions about whether or not you're going to maneuver. Fuel is gold in space. And so you have to make some very hard choices about whether you're going to move out of the way of something or just, hold your breath. And that's not the way we want to do this. We want to get much better at those kind of things.
As you indicated, even the smallest amount of debris can cause a huge amount of damage too.
Yes.
How much time, in terms of time and resources that nations are now putting into space, considering these concerns, the militarization and so on, how is that balance being achieved between positive commercial interests and the kind of more risky defense stuff?
So I think we're seeing more of a balance. Again, as I said earlier, the numbers from 2023 are essentially pointing to the fact that countries are investing much more in defense than they did historically. And they're still investing in civil space. And meanwhile, we have investments in commercial space. The Chinese have investments in commercial space as well. Commercial means a very different thing in Beijing than it does in Washington or in Paris or wherever it would be. But so we're hoping that the positive benefit of what is going on from commercial activities will be one piece of deterrent, only one piece, of course, and that things that are done to bolster security in space, like the creation of the U.S. Space Force. We've just had the 5th anniversary of that. And so that is partly there designed to protect the commerce that we anticipate taking advantage of.
From your work with him in the past, how would you describe Donald Trump's interest in space matters?
So I think the first administration was a strong signal of where Trump and the rest of the administration was for sure. We put out more space policy on very interesting issues in the first Trump administration. In fact, the prevailing national space policy of the United States is the Trump national space policy. Truth be known, there's been large continuity in space activities for the past 5 administrations in the United States. The difference, and the difference as reflected in the commercial space policy, in the national space policy, I should say, is the ability to leverage commercial, to harness the innovation of the private sector. And so I think you've seen already, we're going to see much more interest in space, much more assertive interest in space. And that's going to take a couple of forms. I think that where the government is spending money, it's going to be, and this is where your question about is NASA important, NASA will continue to put more money into the commercial sector, especially under what we expect Administrator Jared Isaacson when he's confirmed. Okay. Secondly, we'll expect to get another look at the regulatory environment and the extent to which these things are permissive. People often think about regulations as blocking things. There are ways to write regulations, and we wrote one in the first administration that encouraged the growth of the commercial space sector.
Well, during his inauguration speech, Donald Trump announced his plan to put the Stars and Stripes, the U.S. flag, on Mars. How much of a boost did that give to entrepreneurs, investors, and so on?
Oh, I think it gave an extraordinary boost to entrepreneurs and investors. It's yet another dimension of our space program. I think a lot of people have interpreted that as coming at the expense of all of the things that have already been planned on the moon. Okay, I actually don't think that will be the case. I think we will see parallel developments. And in fact, the Mars program will actually be helped and accelerated by virtue of changing, adapting some of the things that we currently have in what NASA calls the Moon to Mars program.
Now, of course, you'll be familiar with the American astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson,
of course,
who considers the project of a mission to Mars as an incredibly expensive vanity project with no prospect of return on investment. How do you regard that viewpoint?
So I think, look, it is in our nature, it's in our human nature to explore. And so how you get to Mars, thinking about, occupying Mars, again, here in the Emirates, there is a view that at some point in the next century, we should think about putting a colony on Mars of people to live there, learn about the red planet, et cetera. So I don't know that it really depends on how it's done. There are completely legitimate scientific and even other questions about going to Mars that we do need to explore.
I know, Kevin, as someone who now is so embedded in studying space commerce and advising on it, that you see the importance of the skill sets that are needed to be developed for a future in space. Take me through some of those, because again, I don't know how much there is available for people to go out there and learn about it in schools, for example, but what are the kind of skill sets we're talking about?
Riz, this is a hugely important question, so thanks for asking it. Talent is one of the key inputs to the space economy. And we have a temptation to think that the only kinds of skills we'll need are the scientific and technical skills. And certainly we're going to need as much of those as we can get our hands on. And so those of you that are in PhD programs and engineering programs, keep going. But what you realize is that in the space economy, okay, it really is a broad-based economy. From what I've said, all along here, there are different market verticals that people are pursuing. Space medicine, for example. How are we going to get these bodies to space in a more effective way without harm, or with as little harm as possible? We know from the Apollo program that the investments in space medicine paid back tenfold, if not more, to us here on Earth in the way we think about medicine. And I've given you one example. There's some other examples of medicine on the moon. And so the implications for talent are enormous, because I do need those people that are going to help build the rockets and build the satellites and things like that. But I'm going to need a whole ecosystem of all of the other industries that are participating. I'm going to need people that understand food. I'm going to need people that understand materials. And so, as I like to say, when we went to the moon for 5 days, you could put up with anything. Since we're committed now to going back permanently and sustainably, that has huge implications for all of the other things that we're going to need. If you're going to go for 9 months to the moon, you're going to need a lot of other things than just a quick ride and then come back. And so this is important for retraining workers. It's important in the K through 12 educational system, because what you don't want a youngster to do is to say, oh, I'll never be an astronaut, I need to drop out. And so that's a very important, we need all of the skills that we have here on Earth.
So that actually leads me on to the story of the chef. Because you and I both travel a lot when we're told food doesn't taste so good up in the air. But tell me what happened.
Exactly. So I, all of my space friends who've heard this story 1,000 times will groan if they see this. But it's a story that I think makes the point that I was just making. And so when I was at Commerce, we actually held an event that was designed to bring women and minorities into the space business. And we had a collection of folks in a room, probably about the size of this room, and a lot of scientists, a lot of engineers, technical specialists, et cetera. And a woman walked into the room and she said in a fairly elevated voice, she said, "I'm a chef." And, she got the usual sort of, gee, did she come into the wrong room? What is she doing here? Why is she coming here? And in the same voice, she said, I understand that food tastes terrible in space, and it's going to be my job to make it taste a whole lot better. And if you understand that story, it means that we need artists, we need chefs, we need business people, we need all sorts of folks from so many different walks of life to fuel this trillion-dollar space economy.
What it's basically saying is that life on Earth has to be replicated in space. That means we have to take everything with us, our culture, our music, our arts, and everything else.
Yeah, and again, as I said before, we take our values to space when we go, and that's very important. And so we have to reflect those things in what we bring with us and how we adapt them for living in a very different space environment.
Now, we started talking, this conversation, talking about the value of the global space economy. And for someone who's devoted so much of your, especially the recent career, to this, what value would it be for you to take a trip into space?
Oh, I've been asked this question in interviews before. In fact, I did an interview with the BBC, and the very last question was, are you ready to go to Mars, Mr. O'Connell? And my answer is, I'm not going to go to Mars at this point in my life, but I'm happy to help anybody else that wants to try to get there.
Kevin, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. It's such a big subject. So I'm glad we had a chance to cover so much ground.
Thank you for having me, Riz. Really appreciate it.
Kevin. Thank you, sir. Well, there's plenty to think about from that fascinating conversation with Kevin O'Connell, a man with his head in the stars and his feet on the ground. The future may be sooner than you think. I'm Riz Khan from me and the team. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture. The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Your Royal Highness, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gamble.
We've just heard a highly controversial speech from the new Vice President, J.D. Vance. What's your take?
As an observer who has been a fan of the American experience and experiment, I think America can be more friendly to the rest of the world and engage with them on that basis. It's not a matter that people want to take advantage of America's niceness, because America has always held itself for its interests very bravely and very strongly. So I think a little bit of smile and not necessarily a hug, but definitely an embracing attitude towards others.
You think it was a bit abrasive then?
Well, not so much abrasive as not sounding nice.
Yeah. Do you think that that room felt a sense of disquiet?
Absolutely. And when there was clapping, there was very little clapping. And I don't know if anybody felt like I felt, but definitely it was a signal that his words did not get the clapping that maybe he expected or that he wanted.
Did you
and
hear?
I don't think he wanted clapping.
Did you hear some truth, perhaps harsh truths?
Well, when he's addressing Europe, all of us have truths about Europe. The fact that it is divided, the fact that it is not playing the role that it should be playing, the fact that they're not spending as much on defense and things like that. We all agree on that. So I agree with him on that, definitely.
Tell me this, when you think about what happens next with regards to the Middle East, also a sense of serious disquiet. We've heard very little from the Arab foreign ministers that are here on the ground in Munich, so far at least. In your mind, are they any closer to finding an alternative plan for Gaza?
I'm sure. And I'm surprised that, not just about Gaza, but the whole Palestinian issue. When people say that, well, we presented a plan from America, there are no alternatives to it. The place is full of alternatives. There is the Arab Peace Initiative. That's a very comprehensive alternative that will take into account a final ending to the conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbor. On Gaza, as I understood from newspaper accounts and statements from officials, there were talks about the day after engaged with America and with Europe and other players in the area that were suddenly, abruptly confronted with Mr. Trump's ethnic cleansing plan. So that, to me, is a surprise.
Yeah. The argument from the administration is that on October 7th, Americans died, and Americans should not be unsafe anywhere in the world. And beyond that, neither should U.S. allies. How can Saudi Arabia bridge that gap, bridge that conversation?
Well, I wish Americans would also keep in mind that before October 7th and since October 7th, the people who died most were the Palestinians with American weapons. So if there is going to be a quid pro quo, Americans died and Palestinians died and so on, we're never going to end the situation and reach a final solution. I think we should look forward to the future. Now October 7th is behind us. Now we have to go forward. Mr. Trump's plan is not selling anywhere. So the alternative is either go back to the Arab Peace Initiative, or they can think of doing Gaza along with the Marshall Plan in Europe after the Second World War. America rebuilt the whole continent, let alone the small strip of Gaza, while the people stayed in place. They didn't move the Europeans out of Europe in order to build that. So they can do it very well in Gaza.
When you think about what's going to happen next, there are a lot of questions about what that potential alternative plan can be. Given the weaknesses that you mentioned that are happening here in Europe, do you anticipate that Europe and the Arab states could come up with a plan together?
They already have, as you know, the Alliance for the Two-State Solution. That is a European and an Arab combination. And I know that they've been working with the U.S. and with the United Nations in order to formulate what can be a more peaceful outlook and the result of discussions after October 7th. So give them a chance at least. Let them see, what they can do. But so far, this preempting and unilaterally making declarations is not helpful.
Yeah. Tell me this. Is there anything about the Trump administration that you've seen so far that has been good for the Arab world?
Well, What I can say is that, you know, Mr. Trump has had experience with us from the first term. He said he wants to visit the area, and I would encourage him to do that. And he wants to have more engagement, let's say, with Saudi Arabia. He just announced a summit between him and Mr. Putin in Riyadh. That is something that the kingdom has already welcomed. So that is a good sign. Yeah. And I think he can take advantage of the position, not just of Saudi Arabia, but of the Arab and Muslim world in the world, to make the world a better place.
Do you think that the situation with Palestine can be resolved in a similar summit in Riyadh?
Why not? Why not?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Your Royal Highness, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Ms. Gamble.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Rizkan Show for empowering conversation.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson, and in today's special programme, we take a look back at some of the best interviews during the last couple of days. Hello and welcome to the programme. The US Secretary of State Marco Rubio is in Saudi Arabia. This as the kingdom hosts talks with top Russian officials aimed at ending the war in Ukraine. Well, these talks come less than a week after the US President Donald Trump spoke to his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin by telephone. Well, this contact ends a 3-year freeze on direct contact between Moscow and Washington. Well, when asked about plans to meet President Putin, President Trump said, yes, he will, very soon, adding that he believes that Moscow does not want to take the whole of Ukraine and genuinely wants an end to the fighting.
No, with no time set, but it could be very soon.
Like this month?
Well,
or?
It'll be soon. We'll see what happens. But I think he wants to stop. That was my question to him. Because if he's going to go on, that would have been a big problem for us. And that would have caused me a big problem, because you just can't let that happen. I think he wants to end it, and they want to end it fast. Both of them. And Zelensky wants to end it too.
Well, let's get some more analysis now on these talks and how Ukraine views them and what they might achieve. Well, we can speak to Kira Rudik, who's an MP in the Ukrainian parliament, a leader of the Holos party. Great to have you with us on Arabiya News once again. First of all, will Ukraine accept a peace deal that is struck without Ukraine's involvement?
Hello, Tom, and thank you so much for having me. No, Ukraine will not accept any deals, and we have been very clear together with our allies that nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. And given that we have such a massive army that is fighting, having Ukraine's nation behind it, it doesn't seem realistic that there could be something that will be just given or thrown at us and that Ukrainian nation will accept.
And in terms of what the terms of the deal might be, I mean, Moscow's saying it's not prepared to give up any land. President Trump has already said that Ukraine's not going to be joining NATO. I mean, what concessions might you expect President Trump to extract from the Russians?
Well, for us, it's not even about concessions, but the main thing that should come to make any kind of deal is the security guarantee. This is the baseline, and this is absolutely critical. This is why we are not taking seriously any discussions right now, because they are not based on the security guarantees that are needed. Tom, we here in Ukraine have been in so-called ceasefire deal with Russia since 2014. And I can tell you that there was not a single day when Russia would honor this deal and would not be attacking our soldiers at the front line. So right now, the question that Ukrainian people are asking is how this new deal will be any different. And that's why we need an understanding of how it will be secured and basically who or what in the whole world can make sure that Putin will keep his part of the bargain. As of right now, we have not seen any proposals that would answer this simple particular question.
So how do you feel about President Trump and President Putin speaking on the telephone, getting to this stage of some sort of negotiations? I mean, do you think that he will be able to strike a good deal for Ukraine?
I think, again, that any good deal for Ukraine would start with understanding how it will work further and how the security guarantees would work. The truth is that these security guarantees would be unpleasant for our allies because it's either taking Ukraine into NATO or sending international forces here or assuring that if Russia will break the deal, then somebody will go into full-scale war with them. So before this situation is resolved about how would you guarantee that, I think all the calls and talks and statements, they are just preparative, I would say. And if I may, we have heard many controversial statements from Donald Trump's team, including things that he himself said, what the Secretary of Defense said, and what Vice President J.D. Vance said about Ukraine. And these things, they don't really match too well together. This is why I think we should wait until the real proposal is on the table.
I mean, do you believe that, I mean, we've heard President Zelensky saying he hopes President Trump's negotiating in good faith. I mean, everyone hopes that. But do you think that President Trump does have Ukraine's best interests at heart?
Well, I think Donald Trump has America's best interest at heart. And that I truly believe. And nobody should have Ukraine's best interest at heart because our president should do that. But we understand that Donald Trump made a promise to American people to end the war in Ukraine. And he is right now simply going on with trying to deliver on that promise to American people. However, I think we all need to understand what's at stake here. And at stake here is a precedent that in 21st century, one country can annex the territory of another one, commit all kinds of the war crimes, and then get away with that. And this, I think, Donald Trump, as someone who wants to be perceived as a strong leader, does not want to be a precedent that's happening under his rule.
We heard President Zelensky speaking to NBC during the weekend, and he said that President Putin was a liar and not to be trusted, but he said that he thought President Putin was perhaps scared of President Trump. Do you think that's accurate, or do you think perhaps President Trump is afraid of President Putin?
Well, it's very hard to say right now who is afraid of whom. But what I totally can agree with President Zelensky on is that Putin is a liar. And again, we are saying this not because he has attacked our country, but because we know for a fact, and we are able to confirm these facts with conversation with the facts. So starting from 2014 and then in 2022, then with all the massacres that happened in Bucha, which Putin said that never happened, etc., etc. So I think we should be very careful about the idea that any peace deal or a ceasefire deal would stick. Another important point, Tom, is that right now the war is very different, and I'm not sure that all our allies realize how different it is. This is the war of drones. This is the war of missiles. It's not just people on the ground fighting each other like in First or Second World War. It's very different, and this is why it will be very hard to assure that Russia stopped attacking us, especially with the drones and missiles and other things that will be very hard to monitor.
Indeed, and you know what we're being told is that Moscow is making some gains on the battlefield. There have been fresh reports of that even today, and probably that's boosting Moscow as it goes into these negotiations. I just want to ask you, though, what do you make of President Trump's negotiating style and negotiating techniques?
Well, you know, for the sake of Ukrainian people, I really want to hope that it would work, because at the end, the history will remember the result, right? Right now, Donald Trump perceived as an unpredictable negotiator and person who wants to be perceived as a strong leader. Well, whatever works on stopping the massacres and stopping the deaths of Ukrainian people and assuring a long-term peace, we would support. However, again, I think we should be very careful not to trust Putin and Russia's lies, because they can be very tricky, especially when they would say that it was not them. They will deny their responsibility, same as they have done for many years after they have taken down the MH17 plane that Russia has taken, or right now when they have taken down the plane of Azerbaijan Airlines. So I think we are talking about a more complex picture here, and it would not be Putin trusts Trump, Trump trusts Putin. It would be actually on making sure that it would work.
I just wonder how people in Ukraine and Kyiv are taking all of this in. I mean, a lot to think about. Morale presumably quite low, given that, you know, there have been these setbacks on the battlefield. This small settlement in northeastern Ukraine was captured today. An area of western Kursk has been taken back by the Russians. I mean, is society split in Ukraine, or on the whole, would you say people are heartened by the negotiations? What is the national mood?
Well, people are, of course, concerned, especially because we have heard over the last 5 days many different statements from many people from Donald Trump's team. Our mutual understanding is the following, and we have seen it with the different world leaders. You cannot be talking about Ukraine before you come here, see what Russia has committed, and understand what the war is. And this is why we were waiting for the special envoy Keith Kellogg to be coming to Kyiv before even any negotiations would start. And this is why we are waiting for him to come this week, to look people in the eyes, to see how it is on the ground, to spend a couple of hours in a bomb shelter when Russia launches yet another attack. And there is another very important thing, Tom, that people here on the ground are being concerned, is that just a couple of days ago, Russia launched a drone onto the Chernobyl nuclear plant, something that no one in their sane mind would do. Children in Ukraine know that you don't mess with the nuclear power. And still we see Russia attacking the nuclear plant to send the world a message. And we are very much concerned about this because we have been through Chernobyl tragedy. And we know that that radiation doesn't care which passport you are holding and are you a member of NATO or not. This is why it is really serious concern that I think should be addressed first is arming Ukraine in terms of air defense, so we would be able to protect ourselves and Europe from potential attacks on the nuclear plants.
Now, Kira, you've had to live with attacks on your country for nearly 3 years now. You've even seen your own home hit by explosives. You once said in an interview that if President Putin was standing in front of you, you would shoot him. And I'm just wondering what emotions, what goes through your mind when you hear that the US and Russia are trying to strike a deal?
I would say that I'm just Ukrainian, right? It's not only about me. It's about so many people who suffered and lost the most in this war, who have seen their relatives being captured and then don't know what happened with them. People who have seen their kids taken from them and then kidnapped into Russia. And people who have seen their children coming back in the coffins. So, of course, it's very painful for us. And people from my constituency were asking me this question, what did we do wrong? right? We are fighting for ability to live in our own country with this aggressive neighbor. We are fighting for our ability to define our own future. We are fighting because we are a democracy that just wants to stand for itself. And we are a democracy that has given up our nuclear arsenal in 1994 for the promises that United States, United Kingdom, and Russia will support our territorial integrity. So the question is, what did we do wrong in the world's face that right now we do not deserve for everyone to be standing behind our back and supporting us to the point that we can push Russia back from our territories? And I do not have an answer to that. But I'm sure that after all this noise from different statements comes down, we will come down to this main question of how do we want to live in this world? What is the world that we want to build? Is it the world where is a power of law or the law of power? And I think it is right now in hands of Donald Trump to define that alongside with European leaders. And I really hope that he makes the right choice.
As we speak, European leaders have been gathering in Paris. EU leaders are there. The NATO Secretary General is there. Why do you think Moscow doesn't want European leaders at the negotiating table?
Well, that's very obvious because Europe behind Ukraine is strengthening Ukraine, and Moscow just wants to go back to a bipolar world. Putin is dreaming of restoring Soviet Union. He was very vocal about that. And did anyone care about Europe at the time of Soviet Union? No, it was just like a map on the table, right? Right now, when European Union and together with the United Kingdom is the real powerhouse, of course, Moscow wouldn't want to see them. But President Zelensky said many times, and I support that it is only possible to sit at the table with Putin if we have the United States and Europe behind us at this table.
And that's not happening. So, I mean, and one of the other things I wanted to ask you about is this notion that's been put forward by some countries, notably the UK, about having peacekeeping forces on the ground after an eventual peace deal is struck. Do you see that as being a workable solution? And if so, who would those peacekeepers be?
Well, the main question is not about peacekeepers. The main question is what would happen if Russian drone will kill one of the peacekeepers and how this country would react. And this is a question that I would ask at this gathering that is happening right now of the European leaders. We appreciate you sending peacekeepers here, but are you ready to go to war if your peacekeepers will be killed by Russia? Because that's the main question, right? Not about having certain forces here. And then there is a question, are you sending peacekeepers with the weapons or are you sending them alone? And if you're sending them with the weapons, perhaps you can send those weapons earlier, because I would say it once again, Ukraine never asked for international forces here. We said what we are asking for is to have the weapons, the means to fight back. We understand that it is our own responsibility to fight for our motherland. And we have been doing this. And I think nobody would oppose that Ukrainian armed forces were brilliant at what they were able to achieve with the limited resources that they had. And right now, we still did not receive enough of the weapons that we were asking, or even enough of the weapons that were promised. So that is the key right now. And having the peace forces here, great, fantastic. Are you sending them with the weapons? Perhaps maybe you can send the weapons first, because we will have the best usage of it.
Just lastly, I mean, President Trump said on the campaign trail he could end the war with a single phone call. That hasn't happened, but he has made this a top priority. The Trump administration isn't even a month old, and already, we are seeing action with regards to bringing about a conclusion to this. Lastly, do you trust Donald Trump to strike a deal that is acceptable to Ukraine?
The truth is we do not know. And we know that the main goal of Donald Trump right now is try to break the alliance between Russia and China, because China, with his words, is the key adversary of the United States. And Ukraine falls up onto the bigger strategy of how the world would work, given that interest of the United States lies, first of all, in the Indo-Pacific region and less in Europe. And again, we do not know what's going to happen. We know that we are going to fight for our future same way as we were fighting in 2022 when there was nobody behind us. At the first day of the wars, everybody was thinking that we will go down in 2 or 3 days. You remember that, Tom, right? And so right now we know that we could be left in the situation exactly like that, and it doesn't change our plans. And our plan is to fight for our country. However, if there is a viable peace deal at the table, I think Ukraine will consider that, because we want to end this war more than anybody in the world. However, we want it to work. We cannot have this peace deal that will only be called peace deal, and at the end we'll be just giving Russia chance to regroup, retrain, continue producing weapons and supplies, and then attack us again. And not only Ukraine, but any other countries. If the peace deal is not stopping Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea from producing weapons, then the war will come back, and not only to Ukraine, but to other places on the map.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Kira Rudik, MP in the Ukrainian Parliament. Thanks again.
Thank you, and glory to Ukraine.
Well, as those high-stakes talks between the US and Russia took place in Saudi Arabia earlier on today, let's get a quick reminder of some of the sticking points in any potential peace deal for the war in Ukraine. Ukraine insists that no deal can be reached without its presence. The country also demands the full withdrawal of Russian troops from areas seized during the war. Meanwhile, the Kremlin says that the Russian President Vladimir Putin has stated that he has no objection to Ukraine joining the EU, but NATO membership would be a red line. Well, President Putin has also indicated that he is ready to negotiate the matter with President Zelensky if necessary. Well, speaking from Riyadh, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that NATO membership for Ukraine was indeed unacceptable, as was the appearance of NATO member troops, even if they operated under a different flag. Well, for his part, the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio says that Russia and the US have agreed to restaff their respective embassies in Washington and Moscow and appoint high-level teams to continue negotiations.
We're going to appoint our teams, respectively, that have worked very quickly to reestablish the functionality of our respective missions in Washington and in Moscow. For us to be able to continue to move down this road, we need to have diplomatic facilities that are operating and functioning normally. The point is that we're going to appoint a high-level team from our end to help negotiate and work through the end of the conflict in Ukraine in a way that's enduring and acceptable to all the parties engaged. And the last thing we agreed to is that while our teams are going to be working on all of this, the four of us who were here today, the five of us that were here today, are going to remain engaged in this process to make sure that it's moving along in a productive way.
Well, for more on the Russian perspective, we can speak now to Sergei Markov, who is a former spokesperson to President Vladimir Putin, who joins us now from Moscow. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Mr. Markov.
Thank you.
4 hours of talks. What was achieved, in your opinion?
Mostly important what this main part of the team, international foreign policy team of Trump and Putin made, it was a discussion about more key problems and issues. And they decided on which point they agree, on which point they disagree. They didn't inform us about this, but it was very, very important for the resolving of such problems. So its main results. Additionally, they come to the idea that embassies should start working fully. By American initiatives during more than 10 years, it started even from Obama presidency, the diplomat corps in both countries decreasing. And now it's almost, in 10 or 20 times less than it was before the crisis 10 years ago. Now, this will be amount of diplomats will be recovered fully. It means the number of diplomats will be increased in 20 times. It means that diplomacy will be open. The door for diplomacy will be open. But because we know that the main problem now, Ukrainian problem, but to come from the war to the peace, you need diplomatic relationship. If you have not ambassadors, no diplomacy, you cannot find a diplomatic solution. So it's absolutely inevitable step what they made now. It's first step, but it opens the door for the negotiation about resolving Ukrainian crisis, which is very good and supported by absolutely most in the world, except war maniac Zelensky, and except some European leaders who also sometimes look like war maniacs, like Macron and leaders of the Germany and Great Britain, which has replaced each other so quickly that nobody already remembers their names.
Obviously, your foreign minister called this a very useful conversation. We heard from Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, calling this a new logic, saying that the dialogue was very constructive. What are your observations about what happens next? What's your understanding of what we've now paved the way for?
On the practical level, I think the working group will be formed of the most of the discussed issues. And they will recover diplomats. They will claim Russian ambassador, because before this, Biden administration blocked opportunity for Russia to have ambassador in Washington. So they will create again diplomatic systems. It's the main first will be next. And after this, diplomatic team will start the negotiation on different issues. By the way, the main problem is not the Ukrainian problem. The main problem is the problem of the possible nuclear war between Russia and United States, because United States army, because of order of President Joe Biden, previous President Joe Biden, they in fact take part in the war in Kursk region by attacking by ATACMS rocket missiles. It's number one priority to save from all the world from the nuclear catastrophe. It's very, very important. But on the Ukrainian crisis also, the working group should be created, and Washington, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin will claim specific names who will be from both sides to work on the resolving condition, finding condition for the resolving of the Ukrainian crisis.
Okay, Mr. Markov, so Marco Rubio, the brand new U.S. Secretary of State, said he's convinced that Russia is willing to engage to end the war in Ukraine. Let me ask you this. Russia controls about 20% of Ukrainian territory. Do you see Russia relinquishing control of the 20% that it controls as one of the conditions for bringing about peace in Ukraine?
Forget about territories at all. Russia doesn't interesting about territories. Russia is the biggest country in the world. What Russia has to do, we cannot move those people who live in those territories to the hands of the clear terroristic regime which have been created by Western countries in Ukraine. To protect our people is most important. The main issue, not territory. The main issue is the character of Ukrainian regime, because the reason of why Russia has to start this military operation is to protect also members of citizens of Ukraine from the repressive, neo-Nazi, terroristic, illegal regime which we have in Ukraine right now. So, and by the way, this is security guarantee for Ukraine. We understand that security should be for sure for Ukraine, but security guarantee, not militarization, not NATO troops, but coming back to democracy of Ukraine, coming back to democracy which been in Ukraine between 1991, of calling independence, and 2014. Ukraine was in absolute security those times. So we should back by character of Ukrainian regime to the situation before the coup of 2014, which has come to this catastrophe. It's very simple. It's main Russian demands.
Okay, clearly there's going to be a lot to talk about if and when President Trump and President Vladimir Putin hold talks. I want to ask you something else. Under President Biden, the Kremlin described relations with Washington as being, quote, below zero. Where are they now?
These relations now are above the zero. Because we didn't resolve any problems. Americans still stolen, many Russian monies, so as Europeans. We still have repressive neo-Nazi regime in Ukraine. We still continue the war. We still great sanctions against Russia. We still all have all those problems. But now we have at least some kind of political will from Donald Trump to come to the peace and to come to the compromise. It's like you have conflict with your neighbor. You have fighting with your neighbor. But one moment you decided you should say hello to your neighbor. It's not solution to the problem, no. But it's first inevitable step to solution of war. Russia and United States, first time after 10 years, they say to each other, hello. It's very good.
Sure, and just to pick up on that, I mean, if using the Kremlin's same scale, with below zero being the state of relations under President Biden, are they now above zero? What number are you giving them?
Yes, they're about zero. Some a little bit above zero. Some a little bit in small plus up of the zero.
How confident are you that dialogue and this newfound dialogue between the two sides are going to deliver peace?
Nobody could be sure about this. First of all, we have a tremendous international crisis, which we didn't expect a few years ago. And we have the world changing so quickly and so unpredictable style, which difficult to also make some kind of conclusion about future. We have Donald Trump, who is not the most predictable politician in the world. So it's difficult for analysts to predict. My just guess that possibility for the peace deal in Ukraine on the spring, 20%. The possibility of the peace deal about Ukrainian crisis to the end of this year, 65%.
Okay, that sounds quite optimistic. So you're expecting results during the course of this year, and you're not expecting the talks to collapse. Am I right?
Yes, exactly. I think from Donald Trump's point of view, this conflict should be stopped with Russia, because this conflict moved Russia, first of all, Russian economy to the Chinese economy, which is regarded by Donald Trump, as you know, as main strategic competitor to the United States. Secondly, United States spent so many money to Ukrainian crisis. And didn't spend this money to its southern border. Additionally to this, Vladimir Zelensky and his team regarded as enemies of Donald Trump, because they worked for the enemies of Donald Trump inside American politics many years. Additionally to this, what kind of victory United States can have from Ukrainian war? No any perspective for any victory. Also, if you look at the European leaders who support Ukrainian war, all of them political enemies of Donald Trump. Why he should be with his enemies? So very reasonable for Donald Trump to move to the stopping this Ukrainian war and to accept Russian conditions. Not because Russia is winner, but because Russian condition is very minimum and very realistic. do you want I can say you about Russian big maximum condition to say you? You want me to say?
Yes.
It's very simple. Most of the Ukrainian territory should be part of the Russia, except Lvov and some small part of the western Ukraine. It's first. Secondly, all European leaders should be arrested and go to the prison and to the international, like Nuremberg Tribunal, because all of them know that they supported absolutely clear terroristic regime in Ukraine. It's Russian maximum demands. But Russia understands that these demands probably not so much realistic.
Okay, I'm not sure that those demands are going to be met, but maybe I'm wrong. One thing we heard from the Kremlin today, though, the president of Russia is, quote, prepared to talk to President Zelensky of Ukraine if necessary, they said, if necessary being the key words. In your opinion, is it necessary that those two men talk, and do you think that's likely to happen?
I don't think personally that there's some necessity to work with Vladimir Zelensky. Vladimir Zelensky, he is a drug-dependent person, and he is maniac of the war, and he is war criminal. And he is not represent now majority of the Ukrainians, because Ukrainians want peace and Zelensky want war. So what reason to negotiate with him? Ukraine also doesn't exist as an independent country because Ukraine too much depends on the big Western coalition. And so no reason to, from my point of view, to have Zelensky as part of the negotiation. Most of the Ukrainian politicians will be happy if Zelensky will be kicked out, because most of the Ukrainian, except few groups of the neo-Nazis, most of the Ukrainians want the peace as soon as possible. And they absolutely don't care about Donbass, Crimea, and so on. Ukrainians, they even ready to give Russia Odessa and Kharkov to get the peace as soon as possible.
But if a Ukrainian person was here, they would say, we didn't invade our own country. It was invaded by Russia. They didn't want war. That's what they would say. They would say, you invaded, your country invaded their country. They clearly don't want war.
Russian invasion was humanitarian operation to save Ukraine from a neo-Nazi regime. If you invited those Ukrainians who represent neo-Nazi regime, of course, they will talk what you now told me about. But you, in your media, invited all these 10 years only neo-Nazi Ukrainians. But I personally know a lot of Ukrainians who will say you absolutely on contrary than you was told now. And if you go, if you send your journalists and ask ordinary people, they will say you secretly because they afraid terrorist machine of Zelensky. But they will say you secretly, we want to have peace as soon as possible, because half of the millions of Ukrainians already have been killed in those wars for reasons which we don't know, which we don't understand. You may know that Odessa and Kharkov, they're Russian cities. They 90% of the people who speak, they speak Russian language. They've been part of the Russia during 1,000 years. So what is the reason to fight for Russian cities?
Just lastly, as we look forward to what happens next and possibly these talks face-to-face between the Russian and American presidents, obviously trust is earned. Not many European leaders trust President Putin. But do you think President Putin trusts President Trump?
I think that President Putin trusts President Trump more than to other American politicians. Generally, I would say Russian society, Russian public, Russian elite doesn't trust Americans at all because we have so many agreements with Americans which have been violated. But I think Putin understands that Trump is another kind of politician compared with normal American politician which he made last years. And Donald Trump, he's populist. He represents not deep state of United States. Donald Trump represents these average Americans. And these average Americans, they demand Donald Trump, you should make the peace deal with Russia. And the main enemies of Vladimir Putin is same as main enemies for Donald Trump. It's deep state of United States of America, and this is European, so-called global liberals, something like this. Euro-bureaucracy.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. Sergei Markov, former spokesperson for Vladimir Putin. Thank you very much indeed. Well, Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister Ola Stefanishyna commented on that matter on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference, where European Union foreign ministers also held another emergency meeting during the course of the weekend. That followed on from US statements which said that Europe will not be included in the upcoming peace talks between the US, Russia and Ukraine.
Ukrainian delegation has been invited to participate in the meetings of the ministers of the European affairs under the Polish presidency. President Zelensky had a long phone call with President Macron after the urgent meeting of the leaders yesterday. So they have discussed all the range of issues on the table. I'm happy to confirm that it is an active discussion within European Union on European troops on the ground, on guaranteeing the security for Ukraine, and we are closely following the developments at the U.S. side, but I'm sure that European Union, while being hesitant on many issues, still will be strong enough to help Ukraine prevail.
Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Dr. Stephanie Babs, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary General of NATO. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to talk to us, Dr. Babs. These talks in Riyadh have been described as exploratory talks, not the start of full-blown negotiations to ending the war in Ukraine. And as much as anything, they were about resetting relations between Moscow and Washington. So very much a first step. But do you think this was a constructive step?
Certainly not. Here is the Trump administration, as you rightly pointed out, seeking to reset broader relations with a pariah, with somebody who has attacked and is still attacking another country, with somebody who is warranted with as a war criminal, somebody who has proven to be one of the most aggressive actors on the European continent and beyond. So, no, the US has unfortunately left the broader Western democratic consensus to contain Russia, to punish Russia for its behavior. And it's obvious that it rather seeks to reward Russia. And that is really a tragedy.
So you're saying these talks shouldn't have taken place at all. Some in the Trump administration would argue that bringing President Putin in from the cold makes the world a safer place. What do you say to that argument?
Well, I'd say this is pretty much rubbish. I mean, we have a Russian president who has not demonstrated any indications, any willingness to reconsider his broader strategic objectives. He is still on the war path with Ukraine. As we speak, his troops are destroying Ukrainian cities and firing drones and missiles. He has upgraded in the past 3 years his military posture along all military domains that he has put in place in order to threaten Europe. He has increased his hybrid irregular war activities against NATO and EU member countries. And he has stated on various occasions that he wants to alter the strategic balance of power, weaken and paralyze NATO and EU countries, and expand his own sphere of influence. So here is somebody who has a very clear strategic objective, and he will certainly like to use the so-called negotiation in Riyadh to get a rehab or rehabilitation from President Trump on the world stage, something which he long sought to do, but former US President Biden rejected this. And he will push the American team in order to ease or even lift economic sanctions. And at the same time, everything that will currently be discussed will put him in the limelight back on the international stage. So, yes, he has a lot of gains to make, and he, I think, thinks that he is certainly on the path to victory.
You, of course, know Russia extremely well. You have a PhD in Russian studies, and you know the European and regional geopolitical landscape extremely well as well. Is this a case, in your opinion, of a brand new administration simply being naive, or do you think there's more to it than that?
No, this is not about naivety. I have, as you know, spent most of my professional time at NATO headquarters. I sat through numerous, probably hundreds meetings of the NATO-Russia Council. I even chaired a number of NATO-Russia Council meetings. So I know really what Russians are up to. And in fact, we've had now some 11 years, which is the time since Russia illegally annexed Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine to come to grips with an aggressive Russian regime. And unfortunately, Europeans and also the Trump administration pursued a policy of we must not provoke Russia. They were clearly not willing to really robustly contain Russia. And President Trump, already in his first presidency, used very close financial, personal, and other ties to the Kremlin, who has influenced the election campaign during the first presidency of President Trump and has repeated that. No, there is a network, a very close network between the Trump administration and its associate and the Kremlin and its associates. So here are two clan chiefs meeting each other and try to come into business like we've been in the 19th or early 20th century. So I think this is really pretty upsetting.
So what do you think it is that's motivating President Donald Trump here?
Well, President Trump and his Make America First agenda is clearly geared towards recoupling from Europe. I think he sees himself par to par with the big players in Moscow and in Beijing. He certainly has no interest to really keep the traditional alliances and partnerships that the United States has built over the past 70 plus years. He wants to, I think, use the relationships that he is about to reset with President Putin in order to make gains, profitable economic, financial, personal gains, but also to establish the United States as an actor with, or rather a country, a global power, with whom people must reckon, but not in a predictable way. He uses on purpose this shock and awe disruptive strategy, makes everybody guessing, puts everybody under time pressure, threatens allies left and right hand. So this, I think, is all part of his strategy.
And just judging from one of the tweets you've put out in the last couple of days, you've said this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about President Trump trying to, quote, decouple the Russian-Chinese no-limit partnership. What was the thinking behind that? Help us understand that.
Well, the Trump administration, as the previous administration, have on numerous occasions made clear that their strategic focus is the strategic competition primarily in the field of economy and technology with China. And they are, I think, right in terms of looking at China as an actor who is equally interested, like Russia, to alter the broader international architecture and to break the rules-based system that we have built ever since the end of the Second World War. by putting Putin basically on his side, by trying to side with them, to partner with them again. I think Trump hopes, that the Chinese would have to split their energies between, on the one hand side, Washington, and on the other hand side, Moscow. Whether that gameplay will, yield some results, some beneficial results for the United States is yet to be seen, because we are really very early in the stage. But the no-limit partnership between Moscow and Beijing has empowered Russia to do what it has done in the past 3+ years in Europe, and in particular vis-à-vis Ukraine. Without Chinese support, military, economic, financial, and other support, the Chinese war machinery would not be as productive and as powerful as it is. So I think there is a broader power play here in the mind of President Putin. And from his perspective, Europeans, as well as other traditional partners of the United States in Asia and in the Middle East, they're, let's say, in the second or third tier. They don't really count as they used to count from his perspective. So that's really a fundamental shift in U.S. Global posture and in U.S. global foreign policy.
We've heard from the Polish Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, saying that he was talking about the meeting that was held in Paris, that everyone's aware that transatlantic relations, the NATO alliance, and our friendship with the United States have entered a new phase. I want to pick up on what he said there, a new phase, and ask you for your thoughts. Do you still consider the United States to be an ally of Europe?
I perfectly understand that European governments, for instance, the Polish government, have really a hard time to reconsider the image that they have created about President Trump. They think they can still manage him, tame him, influence him, impress him. But my personal view is that it's not going to work. President Putin will likely take the gains he can make from these bilateral partnerships he has with Poland or with Sweden or with many other European countries in the field of defense and defense, industrial, security-related issues, and he will pocket them, and then he will move on. If he was really a reliable ally, still committed to NATO, he wouldn't have done what he has done, namely to decouple from Europe and put himself on a path to embrace President Putin again. So I certainly have I have really doubts, strong doubts about the reliability of the United States. But this is not to say, that the allies will not try, to work at least punctually and partially on other issues with the United States.
But do you think the United States can still be counted as an ally?
I know you're pressing me for that. I have made up my mind already. I don't think, unless, they would reconsider what they have embarked on. They would consider their policy. I personally don't think they can be considered the traditional ally that we have come to appreciate and we have known for the past 75 years. This is a different administration. They're on a different path, on a different planet.
Yeah, and you've been quoted as saying that you think that President Trump has switched sides. What do you mean by that?
Well, as I already said, if you call an aggressor a war criminal, somebody who has over the past 11 years fundamentally threatened Europe, somebody who is on the path to destroy a country, somebody who has committed countless war crimes. If you call him and say, I don't want to talk about all these things, and I certainly don't seek to hold you accountable, I simply want to figure out where we can get back into business, I would call this a fundamental policy shift. So the United States has left the strategic consensus that it has built over, the past decades with European countries to uphold the rules-based order. Yeah, you can't, preach about rules and then at the same time you put them into the bin. And this is what President Putin has done, he has violated numerous norms and regulations and rules, basic rules that have governed our international system ever since the end of the Second World War. And President Putin is now ready to side with him in order to explore how he can, embark on a broader reset between the US and Russia. So that's, again, I'm making the same point. That's really something fundamental. It's not just an irritant in the transatlantic relationship. This is not just a minor little something. This is really a seismic shift.
Okay, and just lastly, what's Europe going to do about all of this then?
Well, Europe has wasted 3+ years in order to avoid answering a question that, from my perspective, is the most important question. What is it that we Europeans seek what is it that we, describe as our strategic end state? What is our strategic objective vis-à-vis Russia and for Ukraine? Do we want to really help Ukraine win the war against Russia? Do we want to see victory over Russia, or are we prepared to, accept some type of frozen war in the middle of Europe? And if you don't answer that question clearly, you can't possibly prescribe a strategy and use, the functions and the tools that you have in order to contain the aggressor. And the Europeans have hidden behind President Joe Biden's agenda of we must not provoke Russia for the past 3 years. And I really take them responsible, at least partly, for creating this deplorable situation in which Ukraine finds itself in. So to cut a long story short, the Europeans need to do now at least 2 things in parallel. They need to rigorously upgrade and bolster their own defense and deterrence capabilities, their own. And secondly, they must ensure that Ukraine is not thrown under the Russian bus. And this means we will have to continue providing military aid in a much more systematic, much more focused, much more, holistic and strengthened way than we did in the past 3 years. And we need to really side with Ukraine and its own ambition. President Zelensky has made a proposal for a victory plan. He has made various proposals of how he sees the future of Ukraine. And I think it's our job to support that.
Okay, well, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Stephanie Babst. Thanks again.
Thank you.
First, the US President Donald Trump appears to be suggesting that Ukraine is to blame for the war with Russia. Well, he made those comments at his Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida just hours after US and Russian officials met in Riyadh for their first round of talks. Well, Ukraine was not included at those talks. While seizing on complaints that Ukraine was denied a seat at the negotiating table, President Trump said that they could have made a deal sooner. Here's what he said.
Invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. I could have made a deal for Ukraine that would have given them almost all of the land, everything, almost all of the land, and no people would have been killed, and no city would have been demolished, and not one dome would have been knocked down. But they chose not to do it that way. And President Biden, in all fairness, he doesn't have a clue. What he was so bad for this. He was so bad, so pathetic. It's so sad.
The US President speaking there. Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Solomia Boborovska, who is a Ukrainian MP and deputy head of Ukraine's delegation to NATO, who joins us now from Kyiv. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I just want to get your initial thoughts and your reaction to that statement from the US President suggesting Ukraine should never have started the war and could have made a deal to prevent it. How do you respond to that?
We started to have the joke in Ukraine. It's better to fall asleep earlier than to listen to Trump's comments in the interview, because when we get up and see what what he said just couple hours ago, and it's nighttime in Ukraine. This time it was very disgusting. Ukrainians do not accept that, and our recommendation, and it remains to be, and it seems to be as it happened, 10 years ago with the Minsk agreement, when someone started to make deal about Ukraine without Ukraine. That's the first very moment, and we will continue to push on that. And President Zelensky very clearly said that we do not recognize the negotiations that happened in the Emirates. That's the first. In Saudi Arabia, that's the first point. The second one, what President Trump said, that it was total Russian narratives, starting about the 4% of supporting Zelensky and finishing with the point about we have to explore every dollar which was sent to Ukraine. I think that they have to check their spendings within their budget system, because here in Ukraine we can count every artillery shot or bullet that we've got from US. I think it was too much with his comment. My recommendation for his administration, that's just to take the history books about the history of Ukraine and the history of Russians, and finally to understand the Ukrainian mentality. Because at the end of the time and all these negotiations, we are only just on the beginning of this way. Everything will be decided in Ukraine, on Ukrainian soil, with Ukrainians who showed their position on 24th of 22nd year, 2022. Because according to US perspective, we had to lose in 3 days and in 7 days. And that's what they pushed. And that's why they pushed to move Zelensky from Kyiv, government from Kyiv, MPs from Kyiv, that Kyiv has to fall. We are sorry, 3 years of the big, huge war, very painful for Ukraine, and we will still stand and continue to stand under the Ukrainian flag in Kyiv.
Okay, and you mentioned lots of points there, and just going back to what President Trump's been saying, this 4% approval rating for President Zelensky, I mean, I'm just wondering where he got that number from, because that's not what the opinion polls in Ukraine are saying, is it?
Absolutely. That's what I mentioned. Absolutely. That's a total Russian narrative. Russian narrative is 4%. Russian narrative is to demand elections. That Zelensky is not legal on his position, but he is. And nobody in Ukraine claims about the elections. Neither about presidential nor parliamentarian or local one. We all understand about the martial law, the procedures. We all understand that no one will go to Kharkiv or to Kherson, to observe the elections. And first of all, Americans won't go, for example. At least 57% Zelensky has the support. And what Trump said, that's a quite 100% of the Russian narrative. Today we have the special representative of Trump on Ukraine, Mr. Kellogg, and I hope he will bring back messages to Washington, D.C. Ukrainian position, clear understanding about the polls, and support of Zelensky, and all this bullshit which started from the Russian side, how to push their messages and press on Ukraine, how we should react or act or whatever, or obey US. That's not the way.
Yeah, you mentioned the US Special Envoy for Ukraine and Russia, Keith Kellogg. He's in Kyiv paying a visit. Just wondering what sort of messages, what sort of objectives, and what sort of achievements you want to come out of this visit.
I think I hope President Zelensky and his team will pass him messages with our peace plan, with our plans on the front line, with the very clear plans of Russians on the front line. And when Lavrov said that they are not attacking the Ukrainian civil energy and infrastructure, we just got two big, huge, for the last 2 nights, attacks on Mykolaiv and Odessa, which are on the Black Sea shore. Mykolaiv is totally out of heating and electricity. Odessa Children's Hospital was hit, plus energy infrastructure as well. And 200,000 people are without heat now when we have the 11 degrees below zero. I think all these points we will pass. We will show how they use the Northern Koreas, what's going on with their promising, with Russian promising, and all the stuff which is going on between Ukraine and Russia and so on. What can be compromised? What our demands are and our list of proposals are. And I think President Zelensky will be back to his peace plan. Of course, about the withdrawing the troops. We understand that probably it's almost impossible, but no one, probably Kursk will be the one of the issues as well to discuss. Kursk operation and Kursk region, which is the territory part of it is under Ukrainian control, and so on and so on. I hope all these messages will be back to DC.
One message that is being sent back across the Atlantic towards Donald Trump from your president is that President Trump, he says, is living in a Russian disinformation space. Now, I'm just wondering here, given what you've told me and the situation on the battlefield looking extremely challenging, whether you think it's advisable, no matter what he said, for President Zelensky to be baiting the US president. What do you think?
I think our point is to show the truth, what's going on really, and not to accept Ukraine as it happened 3 years ago with Afghanistan. That's the 21st century. It's not the 15th. If they will be out, we will continue to fight for European support, artillery, ammunition, military support, military personnel as well. Why not? It changes a lot. And for the last month and a half, I think Europe has finally to wake up, and I hope they woke up and took out the pinky glasses that they lost the last 3 years of preparing what Russia can do. And actually, Russians said very clearly, and they sent the message, if Europe won't sit as the force part of during the negotiations on Ukraine, they're not allowed to send our troops. Their troops here, they're not allowed to send our ammunition, and so on and so on. We all have to keep the strong position, because at the end, as I told, Ukrainians as a nation will keep fighting. Trump cannot decide instead of Ukrainian parliament how to change constitution. That's impossible. With all respect to Americans, what they did for the last 3 years.
We're not quite 1 month into this new Trump administration. I'm just wondering what his return to the White House has done to morale there in Ukraine.
You know, we had a really huge expectation before his inauguration, and even in the trenches, in army, I've heard a lot like, okay, Trump will come, everything will be done. We are waiting for the mobilization, and so on and so on. He will make Putin to free the situation. He will help us to have a ceasefire or whatever. But but for the last almost months, Ukrainians are very, not to say even disappointed, but we are against of what he is doing and of what he's showing, because it shows that we are now -1 ally on the front. We can stuck, yes, with ammunition, and that again shows that we are alone on the ground, except Nordic, Baltic, plus UK, that who can really help us on a deal, but not with the words, And I would say people are frustrated. That's the same in army, in media, within journalistic this circle, civil society, so many different messages, but again, with the cold hat, we are saying, okay, it's just the beginning. We have to keep strong, just to wait, because the news are too fast. Each night, news, and we have to react. But maybe it's just informational noise.
That's something we're going to be talking about in a minute with one of our guests, trying to sort of decipher Trump's language here and what his technique is, what he's trying to achieve. One thing I just want to ask you about, we haven't got much time left, but Dr. Stephanie Babs, who is the former NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary General, spoke to us yesterday, and she seemed to be saying that President Trump has switched sides. I don't know what you think of that. Do you think people in Ukraine would largely agree with her?
You mean switch side with whom, or with that Europe has to take responsibility for the security?
Yeah, in the sense that he's turning his back on Europe, and he seems to be welcomed with open arms by the Russians. That seemed to be the essence of what she was saying.
But Europe knew that it can happen. They were afraid of that. They were afraid in the last summer. They understood that they could face this message and this position. And, I was really not surprised, but I know that it was a big mess and frustration within the Munich security conference, when J.D. Vance said that, no more you have the same values with the U.S. and blah, 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 blah. But it was quite expected to get this position. And we, starting from the last year, Ukrainians, on each meeting, we said, you have to take leadership. Please decide who can take this leadership. Germany, UK, France, who is among the leaders, who can be able to take leadership not only about Ukraine, but about your security in Europe. Because US will say no to you once upon a time. And they said very, very, very fast, in 25 days. I think as long as Musk will be there in the administration, and this chaotic vibes will go from him through the whole institutions, maybe they can destroy the institutions. Well, I don't know. They are moving quite fast. That's what they were building for the 100 years in other countries, and in US started, to collapse. We will see.
Do you think Ukraine can consider the United States an ally still? Do you think Ukraine still trusts the United States?
We still believe in a bipartisan support, Congress, which is one of the main instruments that can influence. That's the first position. The second one, we still hope probably that Putin will show his real face to Trump, and Trump got nervous and will react. That's actually our expectation for now. And I think it's too early to set to put the mark whether U.S. is still ally. There is still Congress and Senate where we have more or less support. That's important, and we will see with time. 180 days Kellogg took as time, public time, to find the solution. I think this 6 months will show really a lot. Who is who, and who is supporting whom, and who is on whose side.
And just lastly, Solomia, I just want to ask you why you think your president cancelled his visit to Saudi Arabia. He was supposed to go there. We understand he's now not going. Why do you think that is?
Yes. He's planning this visit at the beginning of the March, 10th of March, if I'm not mistaken. And he commented this. He doesn't recognize as a president any negotiations. He doesn't want to meet or to cross with the team of US or Russian team that's obviously, and he don't want to put this all together. All events together, so there is no sense to go now. It's better to do this in March.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time today, Solomia Bobrovska, Ukrainian
Thank
MP.
you.
Thank you for your time. Well, President Trump's comments have sparked backlash on social media, with Sean Savett, who served as a spokesperson for the White House National Security Council under the former President Joe Biden, accusing Trump of fully accepting Putin's propaganda without question. He said that it sounded as though Trump had bought Putin's propaganda hook, line and sinker. Well, according to Democrat Jake Oceancloss, Russia has now won round one, suggesting that the Kremlin had been brought back into the diplomatic fold, even though Ukraine and NATO were excluded. Meanwhile, President Trump's fellow Republican Senator Roger Wicker, chairman of the Senate Armed Forces Committee, agreed that President Putin couldn't be trusted in Ukraine talks. In an interview with CNN, he called him a war criminal.
Do you think that Putin can be trusted in these negotiations?
No. Putin is a war criminal and should be in jail for the rest of his life, if not executed.
Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Sam Nunberg, former advisor to President Trump, who joins us now from Washington. Thank you so much for being with us. Just want to ask you whether you agree with this outreach by the Trump administration to Moscow. Is this advisable?
Yes, I think that the Trump administration and President Trump are wise to re-engage with Russia. Remember, Joe Biden, his predecessor, had not spoken to Vladimir Putin since 2017, warning Vladimir Putin not to invade Ukraine. Subsequently, what we've had is a major hostilities. The United States has armed Ukraine to the teeth. They've continued to arm them with more lethal weapons. And President Trump had long criticized not only Putin, which he had criticized during his time after leaving office, but the Biden administration. It's also well known within intelligence circles within the U.S. and allies within the U.K. Boris Johnson has said this publicly, that they do not believe Putin would have invaded Ukraine had President Trump won re-election in 2020. He has been handed a extremely unstable situation, and he is trying to bring a peaceful resolution to this. This would not be, from what we hear so far within the negotiations, and what Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said in Europe, along the lines with J.D. Vance, this would be in line with what the American people voted for, frankly. President Trump said that he would end this war. Ending wars are not easy. There will be concessions on both sides. But I do feel if you look at President Trump's record in his first term, despite the way he was categorized and maliciously defamed as a Russian stooge, Vladimir Putin was in a much worse situation during his term, his 45th, well, he was the 45th president, as opposed to where he is now.
In terms of those concessions on both sides, I mean, it looks as though President Trump has granted some concessions to Russia before the talks have even got started. I mean, you might not agree with this, so do tell me if you don't. But for example, he said that it looks very unlikely that 20% of Ukrainian territory under Russian control will ever come back under Ukrainian control. He's talked about NATO membership for Ukraine pretty much being ruled out. Has President Trump got any concessions, to your knowledge, in return for the concessions he's already made?
Well, first off, from what we are learning now and from what has been told to allies of the administration, hostilities right now, at least Russia's advances into Ukraine, have been paused. He has been able to have the front line, obviously, less hot. And we have also learned that that not only have hostages been released, which they were last week through Steve Witkoff, we have learned that Vladimir Putin has met with Witkoff for 3 hours, which is one of the reasons why, and I was surprised to see him at the negotiations with the Russians, along with Secretary of State Rubio and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. Now, remember, Rubio and Waltz are two, what we would call hawks. They have said things along the lines that Putin is a thug. But they have also been critical of Vladimir Zelensky and the handling of the war from the Biden administration. I would also note that it is simply unsustainable for the U.S. to continue to arm Ukraine to fight a war where they are not making any advances. It is much easier for the U.S. allies, such as Britain, France, and Germany, to say we will continue We will continue arming Ukraine, and Ukraine should fight to the death. But that's what Ukraine is doing. They're fighting to the death. Now, in terms of other concessions, we'll see. I'm not so sure I would call it a concession to say that Ukraine is not going to get back territory that it's lost, because behind the scenes, I wonder what France, Britain, and Germany really thought. Remember, we have been told throughout the years that Ukraine was making this major offensive, that Ukraine would gain territories, and frankly, along that border, it's tragic. But you look at those cities are in rubble. So it doesn't mean to say that Russia is at a good place. I would also note that President Trump on Truth Social was quite critical of Vladimir Putin. President Trump was critical of Putin's decision once he was elected to invade Ukraine. But he's looking to end this and to have re-engagement with Russia. And that's a larger discussion. The more and more that the United States isolates Russia, what we have seen is Russia goes and becomes its strongest ally becomes China. That ultimately is not in U.S. interest, and that is a major switch from Russia on Russia's position. So ultimately, in terms of world stability, which is what President Trump wants, I think that this is the best course, personally, and I agree with what is said. Now, remember, what is said publicly in diplomacy is not necessarily what will ultimately be the final resolutions. But this idea of not entering negotiations with Russia, re-engaging with them. Remember, once again, as I said, Biden has not even spoken to Vladimir Putin since 2017. You do have to enter negotiations on some friendly terms here, and the idea that we can allow Ukraine to enter NATO while they're losing the war is just unfeasible for the United States. And frankly, we would be doing a favor, in my judgment, to our European allies.
Yeah, I just want to ask you, because, I mean, it seems you're quite solicited when it comes to trying to decode and decrypt President Trump. And you know, we heard him saying last night at Mar-a-Lago that Ukraine should never have started this war, and it could have made a deal 3 years ago. And, you know, he's been quite disparaging about the Ukrainian leader, saying he's lagging in the polls with 4%, which, by the way, isn't at all what the latest polls are showing in Ukraine, because we've just spoken to a Ukrainian MP. Mm-hmm. But what's he trying to achieve there? What's the point of doing that with all of this diplomatic activity happening in parallel?
You know, I long remember, as we know in history, that when FDR met with Stalin, he was quite dismissive of Winston Churchill, because this is a way that I think President Trump is trying to show Vladimir Putin that he is not going to listen to Zelensky, in terms of Zelensky is not directing U.S. policy. Zelensky had criticized. He gave an interview in the United States on Meet the Press, which is a Sunday network show that is the most prominent show, most important show. President Trump had previously given an interview after he was elected, and he said he won't agree to any negotiations. He won't agree to the plan or whatever that the United States negotiates directly with Russia. So what I would say is that Donald Trump is trying to show that he holds the cards, he holds the leverage over Zelensky, and to show Putin that when he's telling Putin, look, I can negotiate a resolution to this. You're going to have to make concessions on your side, which they ultimately will. He's not going to take a bad deal. He's trying to show that, you know, he's the one in charge here, and that Vladimir Zelensky doesn't speak for the United States here. And the United States will be able to push through any agreement that it comes to with Russia.
Just lastly, I mean, what do you make of the first month of the Trump presidency in terms of the overtures that have been made on the diplomatic scene, in terms of the techniques and the tactics that have been employed when it comes to negotiating? What's been your assessment?
Well, the United States has had a lot of successes. I do like him completely reversing course on the Iranian sanctions. He signed an executive order. And while that's another thing I would say, while he gives lip service to saying that he would like to find a peaceful resolution with Iran, I don't believe that President Trump believes that there will ultimately be a peaceful resolution. You've seen him push Netanyahu, despite Netanyahu's political political position domestically to accept a hostage deal. Whether I support that or not, that is certainly something that his predecessor was unable to do. On the other hand, you have seen him also put pressure on Palestinian leadership and to talk about some kind of reframework into the Gaza issue. Now, what I ultimately see is that Donald Trump understands that he has only 4 years here. He understands exactly the situation that he's inherited. And I would say that that's a different situation, frankly, from 2017. I'm quite pleased to see that President Trump, as he said during his campaign, that he knows the ways of Washington and diplomacy now. I'm quite pleased to see that that, in fact, is true. You know, he simply was a novice in 2017, and now he is a seasoned president. So what I do believe is that we will see big changes going on, including in the Middle East. I believe that Saudi Arabia, in short course, will ultimately come to some public agreement to open relations with Israel, not to say they don't already have relations with Israel. And vis-a-vis NATO, you're going to see him continuing to put pressure on Germany, France, and Britain to get to at least that 2% domestic spending on defense, which I don't believe all three of them did, despite their assurances to President Trump 6 years ago.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. But thank you very much indeed for your time today, Sam Nunberg. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that is all we have time for on this special edition of Global News Today. Thank you for watching. Be sure to join us again on Monday for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.